Welcome to Spice and Fiction. What if Bel was the Berserker of Tharvess? Episode 2. In this alternate Danmaki timeline, Bel Cranel is no adventurer. Instead, he stands at the heart of a brutal war between Tharvess and Karsic, leading the feared Dark Hounds as one of their youngest and deadliest captains. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let the story begin. Chapter 6. Brown the Ogre. The eastern sector of Blackhaven shook like a living thing. Not from footsteps, though there were plenty of those, but from the deeper violence carried through obsidian and mortar. Every trebuchet strike on the outer wall translated into a dull, rolling tremor inside the city. The ground flexed beneath cobblestones. Dust sifted from crenellations and lintels. Torches stuttered, flaring bright, then guttering low, as if the air itself could not decide whether to breathe. Bel felt the siege in his teeth, a constant vibration that made sound unreliable, turning shouted orders into broken shapes. Steel rang, but the ring was swallowed by the next impact. Even the screams seemed to arrive late, muffled by stone and distance. Above the eastern gate corridor, the massive wall guns of Karsic trebuchets and catapults mounted within the city's defensive architecture groaned under continuous use. Their counterweights slammed down with a rhythm that had become almost ritual, and the wooden frames complained with each cycle. Beams creaking, pegs shifting, joints bending toward failure. Engineers swarmed them in frantic bursts between launches. One crew chief shouted over the noise, face streaked with soot and sweat. "Stop the third arm. Stop it now." A rope was cut, a winch released. The trebuchet arm shuddered and sagged as if it had been holding itself upright by stubbornness alone. Men climbed the frame and ran hands over cracked supports. "This brace is split," one engineer spat. "By the gods, it split clean through. How is it still standing?" "Hope and prayers," another muttered, half laughing, half horrified. They began replacing compromised pieces one by one. Fresh timbers hauled into place, iron bands hammered on, ropes rethreaded. Every moment spent on repairs was a moment they weren't firing back, and every moment they weren't firing back was another stone from Tharvess carving away at the wall. Below, in the streets, Karsic citizens bled. Men and women carried the wounded into doorways and chapels, using table planks as makeshift stretchers. Children sobbed into sleeves while older hands pressed cloth to burns and broken skulls. Smoke drifted through alleys in sluggish waves. The city was fighting two battles at once, one against the siege outside and one against collapse within. Captain Guard Lucius moved like a blade through that chaos. His armor clinked with every stride, his red cloak snapping behind him as he climbed a stairwell toward a relay post. A runner met him with wide eyes and a shaking voice. "Captain, disturbance near the eastern gate sector. Reports of fighting inside the wall corridor. Unknown assailants." Lucius didn't ask questions. He didn't have time. He turned sharply and barked orders to the nearest command scribe. "3 platoons," he snapped. "Send them now. Eastern sector, wall corridor. Eliminate any intruders and secure the gate mechanisms. We are at war. Every section must be held until reinforcements arrive." The scribe shouted confirmations into the relay chain. Footsteps thundered as soldiers were mobilized. Lucius didn't wait to see them form. He was already moving again. At the eastern gate, the war had a different shape. Here, it was not siege engines and distant rumble. It was close. Breath close. Blade close. A Karsic platoon clashed with the Dark Hounds in a brutal knot of steel and desperation. Shields slammed. Spear shafts snapped. Blood slicked the cobbles beneath fighting boots. Torches cast trembling shadows that made every movement look like two. The Dark Hounds' advantage speed, surprise, momentum was thinning. They had carved their way in like a knife through cloth, but now the cloth was tightening around them. More defenders were arriving. The city was awake now. Bel stood at the edge of that chaos, facing something that did not belong to ordinary soldiers. Brown. They called him Brown the Ogre, and the name fit. He was enormous, not merely tall, but heavy in the way a boulder was heavy. He wore full-plate armor fitted across massive shoulders and thick limbs, each section riveted and layered for maximum protection. The steel was darkened and scarred, but well-made. His gauntlets ended in reinforced knuckle plates, and one forearm bore a bladed ridge like a built-in parrying edge. In his right hand, he carried a warhammer that looked absurd in any other man's grip, its head blocky and brutal, the haft thick enough to be used as a battering ram. A two-handed sword was strapped across his back, its hilt rising over one shoulder like the spine of a beast. Brown watched Bel with a calm that felt insulting. Bel's short swords were already in his hands. Their steel was darker than it should have been, coated in a thin smear of black oil that absorbed torchlight and made their edges vanish against shadow. Not poison, not magic. Practicality. If his blades couldn't pierce plate, at least they could be hard to see. Bell lunged. Lightning fast, low, aimed at the gaps. Brown met him with minimal movement. One gauntlet hand snapped out and caught the first strike on the bladed ridge of his wrist, deflecting it sideways with a sharp clang. With the same motion, his right arm swung the warhammer in a brutal arc. Bell twisted so hard it felt like his spine might tear. The hammer passed close enough to steal air and yank his cloak sideways. The shockwave of the swing alone rocked him. He didn't stop. Bell pivoted into a circular step feet light, body low, and struck twice in quick succession. One slash at the knee joint, another at the waist seam where plate overlapped. Steel scraped. Sparks flickered. No penetration. Bell backed off in one fluid motion, resetting distance. His mind calculated instantly. Heavy plate. No gaps large enough. Even the seams are reinforced. I can't punch through. And worse. Braum swatted away his strikes with one hand as if Bell were an annoying insect. Braum's mouth curled into a smirk. So this is the infamous Dark Hound of Tharvess, he called, voice booming enough to carry over the battle. He laughed, a short barking sound. Disappointing. He lifted his hammer and turned slightly so others could see him, as if performing. Hear me, Braum shouted. I am Braum the Ogre of Karsic, and tonight I will slay the master of Tharvess's hounds. A few Karsic soldiers roared approval. A Dark Hound nearby spat blood and kept fighting. Braum charged. Not lumbering charging. His boots slammed into cobblestone like piledriver strikes, leaving faint cracks and deep impressions. He moved with terrifying momentum, armor clanking like a moving forge. Bell held his stance, blades raised. He waited until the last moment, then slipped aside. The hammer struck where Bell had been, crushing stone. The impact sent a shock through Bell's legs even without contact. Braum didn't stop. Instead of a single swing, he continued. A circular rotation. Hammer whipping around his body like a spinning execution wheel. Ridiculous to watch until you realize the radius controlled space completely. A moving wall of death that punished any attempt to close. Bell tried to step in during a gap. The hammer caught him. He raised his left arm instinctively, crossing it with one blade, and the hidden sleeve blade built into his gauntlet. The blow didn't cut him. It launched him. Bell flew sideways and hit the ground hard near the main melee, sliding across blood-slick cobbles. Pain flared through his ribs like fire. Something inside him cracked, maybe one rib, maybe two. The taste of rust flooded his mouth. He spat, and dark blood hit stone. Braum was already coming again. No pause. No mercy. This time he was faster, anger or excitement giving him speed. Bell forced himself upright and narrowed his eyes. I can't fight him head on. He drew 3 throwing blades with his right hand and snapped them forward. They struck Braum's armor with dull tinks and bounced away uselessly, unable even to bite into the steel plating. Braum laughed, but the laughter ended when Bell moved. Using the thrown blades as distraction, Bell closed distance instantly and stabbed upward toward Braum's face, aiming for the eye slit, the only opening that mattered. Braum reacted on instinct. His left hand shot up and grabbed the blade mid-thrust. Steel bit into his gauntlet, but the gauntlet held. Bell did not struggle. He let go. He flowed around Braum's arm, stepping into his blind side, pulling another hidden blade with a flick and slashing across exposed neck edge and shoulder seam. Then another slash across the backplate joint. Then a cut across the strap holding the great sword. Braum swung the warhammer backward, half-hearted, trying to catch Bell without turning fully. Bell was already gone, springing back, creating distance. The two-handed sword slipped loose. It fell to the cobblestones with a heavy crash. Braum froze for half a heartbeat, surprised. Cuts marked his neck, back, and shoulder plate, shallow lines, not fatal, but enough to show Bell could reach him. Braum's grin widened again. Fast, he admitted, voice amused. But you wasted your one chance. Then something warm touched his brow. A thin line of blood dripped down from above his left eye. Braum blinked, confused, and raised 2 fingers to touch it. When he saw the red on his gauntlet, his face changed. Not fear. Fury. The calm amusement vanished like smoke. Bell did not wait for the rage to finish forming. He sprinted toward the main knot of fighting, diving into the crowd where bodies and shields created clutter. Braum roared and charged after him. The siege outside hammered again, another impact, another tremor. Dust fell. The wall guns creaked under stress. Somewhere, an engineer screamed for rope replacements. Inside the courtyard, Bell's mind worked even as pain pulsed with each breath. Tomas and Corvus are running out of arrows. He could feel it in the cadence from the tower. Fewer shots, longer pauses. We're losing speed. The city is waking. The gate won't open if we get pinned here. A Dark Hound stumbled past him, clutching his side, blood pouring between fingers. Another was down lying still on the cobblestones, face turned toward the torchlight, eyes open but already empty. In Belle's mind the body already felt cold. Belle's jaw clenched. Brown crashed into the edge of the melee behind him, hammer swinging, scattering fighters like broken pieces. Belle kept moving, searching for a solution that wasn't just survival. Because if he only survived, the mission failed. Fury made Brown unstoppable. But fury had a cost. The giant's rage burned away restraint, turning him into something closer to a force of nature than a soldier. His world had narrowed until only one target remained: Belle. Everything else was noise. That included his own men. Brown charged again, warhammer raised high. The weapon came down in a savage arc meant for Belle's skull, but Belle twisted aside at the last moment. The hammer struck a cluster of Karsic soldiers instead. 3 of them were blown from their feet, like rag dolls. One man spun through the air before landing hard against the cobblestones. Another slammed into a shield mate, both collapsing in a tangle of limbs and broken steel. A Karsic platoon captain shouted in horror. Brown, hold formation. The command drowned beneath steel and chaos. Brown didn't even turn. His eyes remained locked on Belle, narrowed, hungry, as though the entire battlefield had ceased to exist. Belle understood immediately. He's not fighting the battle. He's hunting me. Belle moved. Not away. Through the fight. He lunged into clusters of Karsic soldiers, weaving through them like a ghost slipping through fog. Every step was deliberate, every movement calculated. Behind him, Brown followed like a living avalanche. The warhammer swept sideways. More Karsic soldiers were struck full in the chest and thrown aside, shields splintering as they hit stone. One unlucky spearman caught the edge of the hammer's path and folded backward with a sickening crack. The Karsic formation collapsed around the giant. Belle kept moving. He crossed the battlefield in a jagged line, baiting Brown into smashing through his own allies. Panic spread among the defenders as they realized the monster fighting beside them no longer cared who he hit. The giant's fury was absolute. 2 Dark Hounds saw their captain being chased and rushed forward to intercept. One carried a spear, the other a curved blade. They struck together. The spear lunged toward Brown's chest seam, while the blade slashed toward his throat. Brown barely acknowledged them. His left hand swept outward like a swatting bear. The spear glanced off his armored chest with a dull clang, the point sliding uselessly across the reinforced plate. The second strike never even reached him. Brown raised the warhammer and brought it down. The Dark Hound beneath it simply disappeared beneath the impact. The blow crushed armor, bone, and flesh into the cobblestones with a sickening crunch. The body collapsed inward as if made of clay. The second Dark Hound froze in shock. That moment cost him everything. Brown grabbed him by the head with one massive gauntlet hand. The soldier barely had time to scream. Brown hurled him sideways. The body struck a nearby stone wall with brutal force and crumpled to the ground, unmoving. Belle felt the shock hit him like ice water. That man had trained with him, fought beside him. Now he was gone in seconds. Belle's jaw tightened. This thing is too strong. None of the Dark Hounds could fight Brown directly. Not in open combat. The realization sharpened Belle's thoughts. And then, he saw it. Near the obsidian wall, barely 30 paces away, a cluster of supply barrels sat stacked beside a crude siege maintenance post. The black stone behind them trembled faintly with each distant trebuchet impact, dust sifting down the smooth volcanic surface. Thick iron hoops bound the barrels, their wood darkened by years of oil seepage. The sharp scent of lamp oil drifted through the smoky air, mixing with sweat, ash, and burning pitch from the siege engines above. Someone had stacked them hastily too close to the wall, too careless for a battlefield. To Belle's eyes, the careless placement looked less like storage and more like opportunity. The plan formed instantly. Belle sprinted toward Brown again, ignoring the pain tearing through his ribs. His breathing burned. His vision pulsed with each heartbeat. Still, he ran. With lightning reflexes, he drew fresh blades and lunged at the giant once more. Brown roared in delight. He grabbed the hammer with both hands and swung it wide. Belle retreated instantly, letting the hammer crash harmlessly against stone. The giant kept advancing, each step shaking the ground. Another overhead strike. Another. Every impact shattered cobblestones. Belle danced backward, weaving through debris and broken shields, leading the giant exactly where he wanted him. Toward the oil barrels. Brown saw only his prey. He sprinted forward again at full speed and unleashed his most brutal technique, the spinning attack. The warhammer began rotating around his body in a continuous circular motion, turning the giant into a whirlwind of steel and destruction. It looked ridiculous, but Bell knew how deadly it was. He had already been hit once, and he had learned something. He showed me the trick. Bell reached the barrels. Without hesitation, he pulled out his last irritant smoke bomb. The fuse sparked. Bell dropped it at his own feet. Black smoke erupted violently, swallowing him instantly. Braum charged straight into it. The spinning hammer smashed through the barrels. Wood exploded. Oil spilled everywhere. Braum's hammer struck something solid. The giant lost his footing. The cobblestones beneath him had become slick with oil. His enormous weight worked against him as his spinning attack carried him forward uncontrollably. He slipped and crashed hard onto the ground. Oil soaked his armor, splashing across the plates and pooling around him. Braum struggled to rise. Confusion flashed through his eyes. Then he smelled it. Oil. He was drenched in it. A moment later, a lone flaming arrow streaked through the smoke. No one knew who fired it. Perhaps Tomas. Perhaps Corvus. Perhaps pure luck. The arrow struck the oil-soaked ground. The world exploded. Flames erupted in a violent burst. The explosion blasted outward with a thunderclap of heat and fire. Nearby Karsic soldiers were thrown off their feet. Splinters of shattered barrel wood flew through the air like knives. Some men caught fire instantly. Others were hurled against the walls. The courtyard filled with screams. Bell shielded his face against the heat wave. Even he hadn't expected that. Oil shouldn't explode like that. Maybe it was alchemical. Maybe the siege engineers had mixed something volatile. Bell didn't know. He barely had time to think. Because something moved inside the fire. A massive silhouette stepped forward. Still standing. The warhammer still hung in his grip. Braum walked out of the flames. His armor burned black and red. Smoke curled from the plates. Parts of the steel had warped from the heat, but the giant remained upright. He pointed the warhammer at Bell. "You think you can stop the almighty Braum, the ogre of Karsic?" His voice thundered. "You will die slowly for this. I will grind your bones into powder." Bell stared at him in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me." Nearby Dark Hounds whispered in horror. "No way. He's not human. He's a monster." The remaining Karsic soldiers erupted into cheers. Braum charged again. Bell turned and sprinted into the remaining mass of Karsic soldiers. This time they were ready. Spears thrust toward him. Blades slashed. Bell slipped between them like wind through reeds, evading each strike with fluid agility. He vaulted over shields, twisted beneath spears, kicked off a fallen body to launch himself sideways. Behind him, Braum smashed straight through the formation. He no longer cared who he hit. 2 Karsic soldiers were bulldozed aside. Another was crushed beneath the giant's charge. Bell zigzagged through the chaos. His hands reached for throwing blades. Nothing. He had already used them all. The realization struck hard. He had nothing left. Then, Bell saw it. Half buried in soot and splinters, lying crooked across the blood-slicked cobblestones behind him. Braum's great sword. For a fraction of a second the battlefield seemed to narrow around that single object. Torchlight flickered across the blade's broad surface. Oil smoke drifted through the courtyard in ragged ribbons. Somewhere nearby a man screamed. Steel rang against steel, but Bell's eyes fixed on the weapon. The giant had dropped it earlier. When Bell cut the straps, his mind connected the memory instantly. That's it. Bell didn't hesitate. He lunged. His boots scraped across stone as he dove through the chaos and wrapped both hands around the sword's hilt. The leather grip was thick, meant for enormous hands. It was slick with oil and ash. When Bell tried to lift it, the weight nearly dragged him forward. The blade was enormous. Not a sword meant for a man. A weapon meant for something larger. His shoulders screamed as he forced the steel upward. Every muscle in his arms trembled. The blade felt less like a weapon and more like a slab of iron torn from a gate. Gods, how does he even swing this thing? The weight pulled against him like gravity itself. Bell staggered once, adjusting his footing. His ribs burned with every breath. Each inhale stabbing sharp pain through his chest, where Braum's hammer had struck him earlier. Behind him, heavy footsteps. Fast. Bell didn't need to look. He could feel Braum coming. The giant's armored boots slammed into the cobblestones like falling anvils. Each impact sent vibrations through the ground beneath Bell's feet. Too close. Bell planted himself. He dragged the sword up with both hands, lifting it until the blade hovered awkwardly above his shoulder. His muscles shook violently from the effort. This isn't a sword. It's a guillotine. Braum roared and closed the last few steps, raising his warhammer high for the killing blow. His massive frame blotted out the torchlight as he charged forward through the smoke. Bell moved first. With a shout that tore raw from his throat, he swung. The massive blade crashed downward with all the force his exhausted body could summon. Brown reacted instantly. Confident. He raised his armored left arm to block, the thick gauntlet plate meant to catch blades and deflect them harmlessly away. But the explosion had changed things. The fire had softened the metal. When the great sword struck, the sound was not a clang. It was a wet, tearing crack. Steel split. The blade punched straight through the gauntlet. Through bone. Through muscle. Brahm's entire arm severed cleanly at the elbow, spinning away and slamming onto the cobblestones with a dull thud. The sword didn't stop. Momentum carried it downward into the giant's chest. Plate armor split apart like broken doors beneath the crushing weight of the blade. Metal peeled open. Flesh parted. The edge buried itself deep in the center of Brahm's torso. For a heartbeat, the entire battlefield froze. Brahm stood motionless, his massive body locked in place. He slowly turned his head and looked down at the severed limb lying on the ground beside him, as if he were studying it, as if the sight confused him. Blood began pouring from his mouth in thick streams, dripping down his beard and armor. Pain arrived. Weakness followed. Foreign sensations flooding his body. But Brahm refused them. With a furious roar that shook the courtyard, he lifted his warhammer with his remaining arm. One final strike. If he could crush Bell now, Bell would die with him. The hammer rose high above Brahm's head. Bell roared back. Not in anger. Not in triumph. In sheer survival. In the desperate refusal to die. For the Dark Hounds. For the war waiting outside the walls. For the men who had already fallen behind him. Bell shoved forward with everything left in his body. Every muscle screamed. Every rib burned. The massive sword slid deeper. Then, it finished the cut. The blade tore completely through Brahm's chest. The giant split apart. The great sword slammed into the cobblestones with a thunderous crash that cracked the stone beneath it. For one impossible second, Brahm remained standing. His upper body wavered. Then it fell backward, crashing into the ground with a force that shook the courtyard. His lower half stayed upright for a brief, grotesque moment, before collapsing heavily beside it. For a moment, the courtyard fell silent. Not true silence. The siege still rumbled beyond the walls. Somewhere above, a trebuchet arm slammed down with a distant wooden groan. Flames crackled where spilled oil still burned along the cobblestones. Smoke drifted across the shattered courtyard in wavering gray sheets. But compared to the chaos from seconds before, it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Brahm the ogre lay dead. The giant's enormous body lay split across the courtyard stones, armor blackened by fire and blood pooling thick beneath him. One half of the corpse had collapsed backward against the cracked cobbles, the warhammer still clutched in its massive hand. The other half leaned awkwardly before sliding to the ground with a dull, heavy thud. Karsic soldiers stared. No one moved. That's impossible. One spearman blinked slowly, his mouth hanging open beneath his helmet. Brahm. Lost. Another soldier felt his grip loosen on his shield without realizing it. The rim slipped against his palm, slick with sweat. He killed the ogre. A few men instinctively took a step back. Fear spread like a ripple through the formation. Across the courtyard, the Dark Hounds saw it happen. Their captain still stood. The monster was dead. For a split second, the mercenaries hesitated, shock passing through them like lightning. Then instinct returned. Now, one of them barked. The Dark Hounds surged forward. They hit the stunned Karsic defenders like wolves breaking into a wounded herd. Blades flashed in the smoky torchlight. A Karsic soldier raised a shield, too slowly. Steel punched through his throat before he could cry out. Another turned to run and collided with a Dark Hound rushing the opposite direction. The mercenary's sword drove into his ribs. Around them, the courtyard exploded back into motion. Some Karsic soldiers fought. Training forced their bodies to react even while their minds struggled to accept what they had seen. Hold the line, someone shouted desperately. But the words lacked conviction. Others simply broke. One man dropped his spear entirely and stumbled backward toward the wall stairs, terror wide in his eyes. If Brahm is dead, we can't win this. Within moments, the Karsic defense collapsed. A cluster of Dark Hounds surrounded the surviving officer, a captain with a red-trimmed cloak and dented breastplate. His sword lay somewhere on the ground, kicked away during the struggle. Two mercenaries forced him down, wrenching his arms behind his back. The captain dropped to his knees. Smoke curled around him. Firelight reflected in the blood pooled across the cobblestones. Bell barely heard any of it. His ears rang violently from the explosion and the pounding of his own heartbeat. The world sounded distant, as if he were underwater. He staggered forward. Every step felt wrong. His ribs burned with each breath. Pain stabbed through his chest where Brahm's hammer had struck him earlier. His arms trembled from lifting the giant's sword. Still, he walked. The captured captain lifted his head slowly. For a brief moment their eyes met. The officer saw the blood streaking Bel's armor, the soot across his face, the exhaustion barely holding his body upright. And the realization hit him. The gate is lost. Bel stopped in front of him. He didn't speak, didn't threaten, didn't shout. The courtyard watched. With one exhausted motion, Bel lifted the massive sword again. The blade rose slowly, scraping against the stone as he dragged it into position. The captain closed his eyes. The sword fell. One clean swing. The blade split through helmet and skull with brutal finality. The head struck the cobblestones and rolled once before coming to rest beside the spreading blood. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the remaining Karsic soldiers broke completely. Bel turned away from the corpse without another glance. The captain's body lay crumpled behind him, blood pooling slowly across the cracked cobblestones, the severed head resting against a broken shield. The smell of iron hung thick in the air, mixing with smoke, burning oil, and the bitter stink of scorched wood. Flames from the shattered oil barrels flickered along the obsidian wall, casting long, wavering shadows that danced across the courtyard like restless spirits. Bel barely noticed any of it. His ears still rang from the explosion and the clash of steel. The world felt distant, muffled, as if he were hearing everything through water. His arms trembled from exhaustion. Every breath scraped through his ribs like knives grinding against bone. Still, he forced the word out. "Gate," he rasped. His voice was hoarse, little more than a cracked whisper, but the Dark Hounds heard him. They had been waiting for it. Two of them broke immediately from the collapsing melee and sprinted across the courtyard toward the mechanism tower built into the eastern wall. Their boots hammered against stone slick with blood and oil as they ran. Behind them, the remaining Dark Hounds moved like veterans of 100 brutal campaigns, instinctively forming a tight defensive ring around Bel. Shields rose. Blades turned outward. Any Karsic soldier still foolish enough to approach was cut down without hesitation. The two mercenaries reached the mechanism platform and seized the massive iron lever controlling the gate chains. It was thick as a man's arm and stiff with rust from years of disuse. "Help me with this," one of them shouted. Both men leaned their weight into it. For a moment, the lever refused to move. Then, it shifted. A deep metallic groan echoed through the gatehouse as ancient chains inside the wall began to turn. Stone trembled beneath the strain. Dust sifted down from the archway as the enormous eastern gates of Blackhaven slowly began to open. Beyond those walls, in the darkness outside the city, the army of Tharvess was waiting.
Like and subscribe for more Danmachi fanfiction.
Chapter 7. The Price of Sacrifice. The Royal Armada of Tharvess was beginning to sound tired. Not tired like men after a long march, though the men were exhausted too, but tired like machines that had been whipped beyond their limits. Wood groaned where it should have stayed silent. Rope fibers snapped with small, sharp cracks. Winches ground with the ugly friction of metal biting metal. Even the air felt strained, thick with smoke, sweat, and the sour tang of pitch that had been heated too many times. Across the siege line, several engines had gone quiet. A trebuchet arm hung at a wrong angle, sagging like a broken limb. Another sat with its counterweight half-dropped, locked mid-cycle in a way that made every engineer's stomach tighten. Two catapults had fractured supports, their frames warped from repeated recoil. The crews around them moved with quick, disciplined urgency, but their hands were raw and their eyes bloodshot. Men who had spent hours feeding the same appetite for stone and fire. Tharvess engineers and carpenters swarmed the dead machines. "Brace that beam." "No, not there, you idiot, there. If it twists again, we lose the whole frame." A carpenter hammered iron bands onto a split support while another man threaded fresh rope through a pulley, fingers trembling from strain. Someone boiled pitch in a dented pot to reseal a joint. A crew chief paced, muttering calculations and curses, counting remaining spare parts like a priest counting beads. The siege was not only a battle of swords. It was a battle of timber, sinew, and time. Above all of it, the smoke, the shouting, the dull tremors of boulders slamming into obsidian rose the ridge. A natural spine of earth overlooking the encampment, where commanders watched the war like men watching a storm they had summoned. At the top of the ridge sat William Tharvess. He had brought a throne to war. Not a crude field chair, an actual seat of carved hardwood with gilded inlays and the crest of Tharvess embossed into its backrest. Its legs were plated with polished steel. Its armrests were engraved with flowing script and hunting scenes of kings spearing boars and lions, as if conquest were always clean, always heroic. The throne looked obscene against mud and blood. William sat on it anyway. His posture was languid, almost bored, one leg slightly extended, his fingers drumming on the armrest. But the expression on his face betrayed him. The boredom was a mask. Beneath it lay tension, doubt, and the kind of worry that had no place in the songs nobles liked to sing about war. His gaze kept drifting to the siege line engines failing, men coughing, the night thick with smoke. To the obsidian walls still standing, still black, still refusing to crack the way William needed them to crack. And again, to Griffith. Griffith stood a few paces away from the throne, straight-backed and unmoving, as if the ridge itself had grown a statue in silver. His armor was immaculate. Silver plate with careful articulation at the joints, a silver cloak falling from his shoulders in clean folds that did not seem to catch soot the way everything else did. His helm sat under one arm. His face was calm, almost serene, eyes fixed on the distant city like he was studying a chessboard. He did not look worried. William hated that. William tapped his fingers against the armrest again, harder this time. Why isn't he worried? The question crawled through William's mind like a worm in fruit. Does he already have a plan? A real plan, not these months-long siege suggestions and slow strangulations? His eyes narrowed as he studied Griffith's profile. Or does he have a plan to overthrow me? It was ridiculous, he told himself. Griffith was a commander of the Golden Cross loyal to the crown. He had earned medals in the northern campaigns. He had bled for Tharvess. And yet, he's close to my cousin, King Marcus Tharvess. William could still remember the whispers in council chambers. Griffith leaning close to the king's ear, murmuring things too soft for others to hear. The way Marcus sometimes smiled afterward. The way certain officials found themselves retired soon after Griffith arrived in the capital, corruption suddenly uncovered like rot under lifted cloth. Griffith had an eye for truth, or an eye for power. William didn't know which, and that unnerved him more than any army. He shifted slightly on his throne, resting his chin on his left hand. His right fingers continued their impatient drumming. I know almost nothing about him. He had heard stories, of course. Everyone had. They said Griffith had once led a mercenary host before he wore silver and command. They said he had helped King Marcus conquer the north, where snow never melted and the mountains rose like broken teeth. The white peak spire of the winter mountains. They said the dwarves had lived in those peaks, deep in their minds, hoarding or like dragons hoarded gold. They said Tharvess had failed to crack them for decades until Griffith appeared, and the mines were suddenly Tharvess property. The dwarves either subdued or vanished into deeper stone. William swallowed. That campaign made Marcus rich. Those mines, those ores built half the king's new fleets and paid for half his wars. Griffith had done that. And then there were the woodland elves. William's jaw tightened as another memory surfaced. Griffith had brokered a treaty with them, something no human commander had managed in generations. The elves hated humans, not as a childish prejudice, but as a doctrine. Humans cut trees. Humans built roads. Humans burned forests for farms. To the woodland clans, that was blasphemy. And yet Griffith had convinced them. Not merely to tolerate Tharvess, but to sign agreements, trade routes, supply arrangements, reconnaissance support. William had heard of it and felt admiration. Then suspicion. How? What did he offer them? What did he promise? William glanced again at Griffith. The man stood perfectly still, as if the noise below could not reach him. The siege line was chaotic, engineers shouting, carpenters hammering, wounded men crying in the distance, but Griffith remained composed. Too composed. William's fingers tapped faster. Then, a disturbance rose from below the ridge. A scout, mud-splattered, breathing hard, stumbled up the slope in a desperate sprint, nearly falling twice. His cloak was torn. Ash streaked his face. He carried the smell of smoke and cold sweat like a second skin. He reached the throne and dropped to one knee, so quickly his knee struck stone. "My lord," he gasped. William leaned forward sharply. "Speak." The scout swallowed, forcing breath into his lungs. "The eastern gate of Blackhaven." His voice cracked. "It's open. Open from within." For a heartbeat, William didn't understand. Open. The gate had been sealed behind layers of iron and stone. They had been pounding walls all night. Their engines were breaking. Their men were dying. Open. William's eyes widened. "By who?" he demanded. The scout hesitated, trembling. "One of ours, my lord. The Dark Hounds, Captain Bell." William froze. Captain Bell. Griffith's hand. His infiltration. William's throat went dry. He looked at Griffith. And for the first time all night, Griffith's expression changed. It was subtle. A flicker. The corner of his mouth lifted. A grin that lasted no more than a heartbeat. But William saw it. And the grin wasn't pride. It wasn't relief. It wasn't even satisfaction. For that single moment, Griffith's face displayed something else entirely. A manic smile, sharp and hungry, like a blade being drawn. William's skin prickled. Goosebumps rose along his arms beneath his cloak. Then Griffith smoothed his features again, returning to perfect calm as if the smile had never existed. He stepped forward slightly. "Good," Griffith said softly, almost gently. Then, louder command voice now, carrying despite the siege thunder. "Bring that message to every commander on this war camp." He looked down at the scout, eyes cold and bright. "Tell them the eastern gate is ours. Tell them to advance. Now." The scout nodded frantically. "Yes, Commander." Griffith turned his head toward William. "My lord," he said, polite as ever. "Bell has succeeded." William's fingers stopped tapping. For a moment, he could only stare past Griffith to the distant black city where torchlight flickered against obsidian. He imagined the gate creaking, open chains groaning, stone trembling. Blackhaven had held for centuries, and now it was opening its throat. William forced himself to breathe. Then he straightened on his throne, mask returning. "Advance," he ordered, voice harsher than he intended. "All banners. All companies. Move." Below the ridge, horns sounded. Not the long, mournful calls of warning. The short, sharp blasts of assault. Tharvess banners snapped in the wind as captains shouted orders and formations tightened. Infantry formed ranks and disciplined block shields raised, spears bristling. Archers shifted into supporting lines. Knights mounted, metal clanking, horses snorting hot breath into the cold night air. And then, the cavalry moved. First a slow roll of hooves. Then faster. A heavy thunder building like a storm rolling across earth. Hundreds of horses surged forward, armor glinting in torchlight, their breath steaming, their eyes wide and wild. The sound was enormous. Hooves pounding hard ground with a rhythm as loud as trebuchet impacts. Harnesses rattling, metal plates clanging. Men shouting into the rush. The army advanced toward Blackhaven's eastern gate like a dark tide finally given permission to break. From the ridge, William watched the mass movement and felt his worry shift into something sharper. Hope, prestige, victory. And beneath it, a thin, cold thread of dread that had nothing to do with Karsic. He glanced once more at Griffith. The commander stood tall, silver cloak lifting slightly in the wind, eyes locked on the black city as if he could already see the outcome. William wondered, not for the first time, whether Griffith was merely helping win the war, or whether he was ensuring the war unfolded exactly the way he wanted. From the ridge, Blackhaven loomed beneath the smoke-choked sky, its obsidian walls black and jagged against the firelight. From this distance, the city looked less like a fortress and more like a wounded beast breathing slowly, stubbornly, waiting for the killing blow. Trebuchet stones had scarred its towers, and flames flickered along the lower districts where stray shots had landed. The eastern gate now hung open like a torn throat. To the army of Tharvess, the city seemed finished. Conquered. Already dying. But none of them, not the captains, not William, yet knew what was moving beneath its streets. Hours earlier, beneath the city of Blackhaven, the war above sounded like distant thunder. Not the sharp, immediate violence of battle, but a slow, muffled rumble that traveled through stone and earth like the breathing of some vast creature buried beneath the city. Every now and then a heavier impact rolled through the tunnels, a deep vibration that rattled loose pebbles from the ceiling and sent small ripples dancing across the surface of the foul water. Trebuchets. Even underground, you could feel them. Each strike landed somewhere above the obsidian walls of Blackhaven, and the echoes crawled through the sewer system like ghosts trying to remember the shape of the sound. Down here, however, the war had a different face. Darkness ruled the tunnels. Torches helped, but only barely. The flames licked weakly at the blackness, casting small islands of flickering orange light that struggled against the suffocating dark pressing in from every direction. Every wall was damp stone slick with algae and rot. Every step sank into shallow water or thick mud. And the smell. Gods! The smell was unbearable. Rotten sewage, stagnant water, mold, dead animals, old blood from something that had died here long before any man entered these tunnels. The air itself felt heavy with decay, each breath tasting like spoiled meat and damp stone. Even the Dark Hounds, hardened mercenaries who had marched through burning cities and corpse-filled battlefields, were struggling not to gag. At the front of the column walked Joran. He held his torch high with his left hand, lifting the flame above his head so its light spread across the curved tunnel walls. In his right hand, he carried a short sword, its blade already wet with sewer water from occasional slips against the narrow stone corridor. His posture was tense, every muscle alert. Joran studied the terrain like a hunter stalking through hostile woods. The warm torchlight crept across the tunnel walls, revealing patches of green-black algae clinging to the stones, thick ropes of roots hanging down through cracks above, and the sluggish current of murky water flowing around their legs. Every shadow looked like something waiting to move. Behind him, the rest of the Dark Hounds advanced carefully in a single line. Their boots splashed quietly with each step, though they tried their best to keep silent. The water reached halfway to their calves, thick with mud and refuse that clung to leather and cloth. One of the mercenaries muttered under his breath, "Gods, if I ever see another sewer after this, I'm burning the city above it." No one laughed. The tunnels swallowed humor as easily as they swallowed light. Joran raised his torch slightly higher, studying the next stretch of tunnel. The passage curved ahead, the stonework older here, large cobbles fitted together centuries ago when Blackhaven was first built. The sewer widened slightly in that direction, though the water seemed deeper as well. Then, Joran froze. The motion was sudden enough that the man behind him nearly collided with his back. Joran lifted his fist. The universal signal. Stop. The Dark Hounds halted immediately. The water settled slowly around their legs as the ripples faded. Joran listened. At first there was nothing. Only the distant rumble of siege engines above and the soft drip of water falling from cracks in the stone ceiling. Then, a sound. Something subtle. A small disturbance in the water. Joran's jaw tightened. His instincts screamed. Something isn't right. He lowered the torch slightly and spoke in a low whisper. Hold. Behind him, one of the Dark Hounds leaned closer. You hear that? Joran didn't answer. Because he did. A whisper came from farther back in the column. Something moved up ahead. Another voice, nervous. There's something in the water too. Joran slowly swept the torchlight across the tunnel. The flame illuminated the surface of the murky water, revealing floating scraps of debris-rotted wood, broken pottery, scraps of cloth caught in the slow current. For a moment, everything seemed still. Then, a ripple. Not caused by them. Joran's grip tightened around his sword. Move slow, he whispered. Quiet. The Dark Hounds began advancing again. Carefully. Each step measured. But no matter how cautious they were, the water betrayed them. Every movement sent small ripples outward through the tunnel, disturbing the stagnant surface. And those ripples carried sound. Something shifted again ahead of them. Another ripple, larger this time. Joran's eyes narrowed. He could feel it now. Predators. He didn't know what kind. But something was watching. The tunnel widened ahead, opening into a slightly larger chamber where the water dropped away from the walls, leaving a raised platform of cobblestones above the sewer current. The stones were slick with algae, their green surfaces reflecting the weak torchlight. Joran stepped toward it. Up there, he whispered. One by one, the Dark Hounds followed him toward the platform. The water deepened near the edge, rising to their knees before dropping away into a darker channel that flowed beneath the stone. Joran climbed first. His boots scraped against the algae-covered cobblestones as he pulled himself up onto the platform. He stood immediately, sword raised, scanning the darkness. The torchlight stretched across the chamber. Empty. No movement. Clear, he whispered. The others began climbing up. 1, 2, 3. Each man carefully hauling himself onto the slippery stone surface while trying to keep balance. The platform was narrow but solid, the water flowing around it on both sides like a sluggish moat. For a moment, it seemed like they had found a safe place to regroup. Then, a scream shattered the silence. Aya! The sound ripped through the chamber. Every Dark Hound spun around instantly. Torchlight swung wildly, and the water exploded. Massive shapes surged from the murky depths. Alligators. Huge sewer-fed beasts with armored backs and jaws filled with jagged teeth erupted onto the platform with terrifying speed. One of them clamped onto a Dark Hound's leg. Another lunged upward from the water behind him. And in the middle of it all, Chad. The man screamed again. Chad. The Dark Hound who cooked for them. The man who always whistled when dinner was ready. The one who had a habit of humming old tavern songs while stirring stew over the fire. Now he was being dragged backward. 3 alligators had him. One locked onto his arm. Another onto his leg. The third lunged for his torso. The sound of tearing flesh echoed horribly in the tunnel. Chad screamed once more. Then the sound cut off. Blood flooded the cobblestones as the beasts tore his limbs apart. For a heartbeat, the Dark Hounds froze in shock. Then training took over. Weapons flashed. Swords, spears. Kill them. One man dropped to a knee and fired an arrow directly into the eye of the nearest alligator. The shaft buried deep. The beast convulsed violently, thrashing across the platform before sliding back into the water. Another dark hound drove a spear downward into the skull of a second creature. The spear struck bone and stuck fast. The alligator snapped wildly, jaws clattering inches from the man's leg. Joran reacted instantly. He swung his torch in a wide arc, flames whipping through the air. "Back!" he shouted. The fire made the nearest alligator recoil slightly, its yellow eyes blinking against the sudden light. For a moment, it worked. The beasts hesitated, their instincts warring between hunger and fear. Then another one lunged. Joran stepped forward and drove his sword downward. The blade plunged straight into the creature's eye. The alligator thrashed violently, nearly pulling the weapon from his grip. Joran ripped the sword free just as another set of jaws snapped toward his leg. He rolled sideways across the algae-slick cobblestones, barely avoiding the bite. The creature's teeth slammed shut where he had been standing. "Smoke!" someone shouted. A dark hound grabbed one of their smoke bombs and hurled it directly toward the edge of the platform where more alligators were climbing up from the water. The bomb struck the stone, then burst. Black smoke erupted instantly. Thick, choking. The irritant chemicals inside the mixture burned eyes and lungs alike. The alligators recoiled violently, hissing and thrashing as the smoke filled their nostrils. Even predators had limits. The beasts retreated. One by one, they slid back into the murky water, their armored backs disappearing beneath the surface. The platform was suddenly empty again, except for the blood and the pieces of Chad. Joran didn't look down. He didn't allow himself to. Instead, he turned sharply. "Move," he barked. The dark hounds didn't hesitate. They sprinted down the tunnel, boots splashing through the shallower water as they fled deeper into the sewer system. Behind them, the smoke continued to billow across the chamber, obscuring the blood and the water alike. Eventually, the tunnel rose slightly. The water level dropped. Soon they were moving through damp stone corridors rather than waist-deep sewage. Joran slowed slightly, breathing hard, but relieved. At least they were out of the water. He raised his torch again, studying the next stretch of tunnel. The darkness ahead swallowed the light just as greedily as before. But now they knew what hunted in these depths. And the sewer tunnels of Blackhaven suddenly felt far more alive than any battlefield above.
Like and subscribe for more Danmachi fanfiction.
Chapter 8. A Wound in the Earth. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. Above them, the war for Blackhaven still raged, trebuchets hurling stone, soldiers shouting, walls shaking beneath the fury of siege engines. But here beneath the city, that chaos had faded into something distant and hollow. The sounds reached the sewer tunnels only as faint tremors through the stone, like thunder heard through layers of earth. Joran felt those tremors through his boots. Each distant impact rolled through the tunnels and vanished again, leaving behind the heavy silence that always followed. Silence was dangerous. Silence meant you could hear things you were not meant to hear. The Dark Hounds moved carefully through the winding underground passage, their formation tighter now than before. There were fewer of them than when they had first entered the sewer system. Chad's screams still echoed faintly in their minds, even though none of them spoke about it. The torchlight had long since dimmed. Joran still carried one, but he kept the flame low and shielded, allowing only enough light to see the immediate path ahead. The smoke from it crawled slowly along the curved stone ceiling, mixing with the damp smell of old sewage and wet stone. At least, that had been the smell before. Now it was different. Joran noticed it first. He slowed slightly, raising the torch a little higher as his eyes studied the walls around them. Something had changed. Before, the sewer tunnels had looked ancient and neglected, stone blocks uneven, algae clinging to the mortar, water stains marking centuries of slow decay. The structures had felt abandoned, like forgotten bones beneath the city. But here the walls were different. The stones were smoother, the joints between them tighter. Even the floor beneath their boots felt more deliberate, the cobblestones carefully fitted instead of loosely scattered. The water that once filled the tunnels was gone, replaced by dry stone channels running along the edges of the passage. Joran's brow furrowed. He lifted the torch higher and studied the ceiling. The arch above them was perfectly shaped. Too perfect. This section of the underground system had been maintained. Recently, that realization made his stomach tighten. Behind him, one of the Dark Hounds shifted uneasily. "You seeing this too?" the man whispered. Joran nodded slowly. "Yeah." They kept moving. Every step echoed faintly in the passage, though the sound seemed strangely muted as if the stone itself swallowed noise. The deeper they went, the more obvious the changes became. The walls were no longer slick with algae. There were no cracks leaking water. No loose rubble. Someone had been maintaining this place. Joran's thoughts began turning. Slave traders? It was possible. Smugglers had used sewer passages before to move goods beneath city gates. Human cargo, contraband, stolen, or forbidden artifacts, anything that could avoid the watchful eyes of guards and tax collectors. Or merchants avoiding tolls. Blackhaven was the heart of trade for half the region. Every caravan entering its gates paid heavily for the privilege. Some merchants might have built secret routes beneath the city to slip goods in and out without paying. Or criminal networks. Smugglers. Assassins. Secret societies. Joran didn't like any of those possibilities. Behind him, a quiet voice spoke. Joran. He glanced back. Liz had stepped closer to the wall, her gloved fingers brushing lightly across the stone surface. There's something here. Joran moved toward her, lowering the torch so the flame illuminated the wall. Liz pointed. At first he saw nothing. Then the light caught the grooves. Carved markings. Not random scratches. Scriptures. Thin lines etched into the stone in repeating patterns, forming symbols that curved and twisted in ways Joran didn't immediately recognize. Liz traced one of them lightly. Could be direction markers, she whispered. Smugglers use signs like this sometimes. Joran studied them carefully. The symbols repeated every few paces along the wall, sometimes arranged in pairs, sometimes alone. He frowned. Maybe, he said quietly. He glanced deeper down the passage. But this place doesn't look like a normal smuggling tunnel. Liz tilted her head. What do you mean? Joran gestured behind them. The sewer tunnels earlier, those were neglected. Old. Barely maintained. He turned back toward the carved symbols. This section is different. He touched the stone wall. Someone's maintaining this place. Masons. Engineers. Carpenters. His eyes narrowed. And those alligators we fought earlier? Liz nodded slowly. The grand sewer tunnels. Joran nodded. I think they're part of the defense. The other Dark Hounds exchanged uneasy glances. Defense, someone whispered. Joran's voice lowered. Think about it. He pointed back the way they had come. If someone wanted to hide this passage, they'd need something to keep people from exploring the sewers. Liz's eyes widened slightly. The alligators. Joran nodded once. Exactly. They resumed moving. But slower now. More cautious. The deeper they advanced, the stranger the passage became. The structure shifted again. The stone blocks here were not the same shape as the earlier tunnels. The edges were sharper. The arches above their heads rose higher, smoother, almost elegant compared to the brutal practicality of sewer architecture. One of the Dark Hounds muttered quietly. I thought Blackhaven was built by dwarves. Joran nodded. So did I. The man glanced around uneasily. Then why does this place not look like dwarven work? Joran didn't answer immediately. Because the same thought had already begun forming in his mind. Dwarven construction was unmistakable. Heavy. Practical. Every block fitted for strength first, aesthetics second. These passages. These looked almost ceremonial. The stones were carved in shapes that suggested careful design rather than simple function. Joran stopped walking. His hand lifted instantly. The signal. Hold. The Dark Hounds froze. Joran turned slowly, scanning the tunnel behind them, then the darkness ahead. His instincts were screaming now. A quiet alarm rising in the back of his mind. His heartbeat had begun to quicken. Something was wrong. Very wrong. He spoke quietly. Perimeter. The Dark Hounds moved without hesitation, forming a defensive circle around the passage. Weapons came free from sheaths, blades catching the faint glow of Joran's torch. Silence pressed against them from every direction. It was not the natural quiet of an empty tunnel, nor the distant hush of a place forgotten by the world. This silence felt heavier, thick, and suffocating, as though the stone itself had swallowed every sound and refused to give it back. Even the faint echoes of the war above seemed to have faded here, leaving only the slow drip of unseen water and the shallow breaths of the Dark Hounds. Then, the smell hit. It rolled through the tunnel like a living thing, creeping along the floor and curling into their nostrils before anyone could react. Not sewage. Not decay. Something worse. Sulfur. Rot. The scent burned the back of the throat the moment it entered the lungs, sharp, acrid, and nauseating. It carried the foul heat of volcanic vents mixed with the greasy stench of spoiled meat. The air tasted wrong, like something that had been dead far too long yet refused to stay buried. Several of the Dark Hounds gagged softly. One of them coughed into his sleeve, eyes watering as he spat onto the stone. "What the hell is that?" he muttered hoarsely. Joran's grip tightened around the hilt of his sword until the leather creaked faintly beneath his fingers. He didn't answer, because the smell felt wrong. It didn't belong in a sewer. Sewers smelled of rot, filth, and stagnant water, but this scent carried something deeper. Something ancient. Something that reminded him of burned bone and old grave pits after a battlefield had been left too long in the sun. Goosebumps crawled across his arms. He turned slowly, glancing behind them again. The darkness seemed thicker now, heavier. Watching. Waiting. Joran lowered his voice until it was barely more than a breath. "Stay sharp." His gaze swept the passage slowly, scanning every corner, every shadow between the carved stones. "I don't like this place." Another tremor rolled faintly through the stone beneath their boots. But this one didn't feel like a trebuchet impact. Those tremors had been distant, deep vibrations that traveled through layers of earth from the battlefield above. This one felt different. Closer. A deep rumble somewhere ahead, like a massive weight grinding slowly through the rock itself. The Dark Hounds exchanged uneasy glances and instinctively turned toward the darkness deeper in the passage. Joran studied the shadows for another moment. Then he made a decision. He reached up and closed his fingers around the base of the torch. With a quick motion, he smothered the flame. The fire died with a soft hiss. Instant darkness swallowed them. For a moment, the world vanished completely. No light. No shape. Only breathing. Then, the markings on the walls began to glow. The scriptures Liz had noticed earlier slowly awakened as the torchlight disappeared. Thin carved grooves along the stone walls filled with a faint, sickly green light. It seeped from the etched lines like dim liquid fire. Barely enough to illuminate the passage. But enough. The symbols pulsed slowly, each faint glow brightening and fading in a steady rhythm. Like veins carrying dim light through the stone. Joran stared at them in silence. Whatever this place was, it wasn't a sewer. He raised 2 fingers and gestured forward. The Dark Hounds moved again. Now without torches. They used the shadows to hide themselves, advancing slowly through the faint green glow bleeding from the carved symbols. Their boots made almost no sound. The floor beneath them was smooth, perfectly laid stone fitted so tightly together that even the edges between blocks were nearly invisible. No rubble. No loose gravel. No debris. Nothing that might betray careless movement. That detail alone made Joran uneasy. Someone maintained this place regularly. And not recently abandoned maintenance either. This stonework had been cleaned. Preserved. Protected. He studied the glowing scriptures carefully as they passed. Every symbol. Every pattern. Memorizing them. Some curved like spirals, others twisted into shapes that reminded him of coiled serpents or branching antlers. None of them resembled any written language he had ever seen. If this was some kind of hidden system, directions, warnings, protections, then understanding it might be the only thing keeping them alive down here. Behind him, the Dark Hounds moved with the quiet discipline of experienced soldiers. Steel shifted softly against leather. Someone's armor strap creaked faintly before falling silent again. No one spoke. The air had grown colder. The sulfur stench lingered in their lungs. And beneath it all, that rumble waited. The passage curved ahead. The green light pulsed softly across the walls, casting faint shadows that slid slowly across the carved stone. Dust sifted loose from cracks above, falling in thin gray streams that glittered briefly in the sickly green glow of the runes before vanishing into the darkness below. Joran lifted one hand, signaling the column to slow. The passage widened ahead. The carved symbols along the walls grew denser now, the glowing lines twisting into tighter spirals and intersecting patterns that pulsed faintly beneath the stone surface. The air felt heavier here, thick with the bitter scent of sulfur and something older, something metallic and sour that clung to the back of the tongue. The rumble came again. Closer. Not the distant pounding of siege engines. Something else. Something moving. Joran advanced carefully around the curve of the tunnel, pressing his shoulder close to the damp stone as he peered ahead. The green light spilled forward into a widening darkness where the corridor suddenly ended. He stepped through first. The moment his boots left the narrow passage, the air changed. The chamber was not a sewer. It was a wound in the earth, cleanly cut, carefully shaped, and wrong in a way Joran could feel in the back of his teeth. They stepped out of the narrow, glowing passage and into a wide circular space that swallowed sound. The walls curved upward in a perfect half-sphere, as if a giant hand had scooped out stone and polished it smooth. Above them, the layered anatomy of the city was exposed like stratified flesh, bedrock, old foundations, The underside of Blackhaven's streets all carved cleanly into a seamless dome. And everywhere were symbols. Glowing markings crawled across the chamber's surface in spirals, rings, and latticework that made the eye struggle to follow. Some were sharp and angular, others flowing and organic like roots or veins. Near the edges they pulsed faintly, a dim green-blue glow that barely filled the chamber. But the closer the symbols drew toward the center, the brighter they became until the heart of the room glared like a lantern behind thin cloth. Joran's breath caught. Not from all. From the cold certainty that this place had never been meant for men. The ceiling, if you could call the domed upper curve a ceiling, held patterns that resembled stars. Not true constellations, not anything natural. These stars were etched into the stone in clusters of 5, 7, 9, each cluster connected by lines that formed a spiraling map leading down toward the chamber's center. The spiral made Joran's stomach tighten. It drew the eye inward like a current. Like a drain. The Dark Hounds stepped into the space with cautious feet, boots whispering over smooth stone. The smell down here had changed, no longer sewage and rot and damp algae. Now it was sulfur. And something else beneath it. A sweet note, almost like spoiled fruit left too long in heat. The kind of smell that came from things that should not be opened. Joran lifted a hand. "Circle," he murmured. The Dark Hounds moved automatically, spreading into a defensive ring along the chamber's edge. Blades came out. Bows were raised, but not yet drawn. Their cloaks looked almost blacker against the glow, their faces pale in the strange light. At the very center of the chamber stood a crystal. It was the height of a man. Not perfectly shaped like a gem in a crown, but grown from within itself, facets uneven, angles jagged, as if it had been forced upward through stone. It shimmered faintly, not with light like glass, but with something internal, like an ember behind ice. The stone at its base looked melted. Not broken, not chipped, melted, flowed, then hardened again, anchoring the crystal in place like a stake hammered into the earth. Joran approached it slowly. Each step made the symbols brighten slightly under his boots, a faint pulse rippling outward like water disturbed by a dropped coin. He stopped a pace away and stared. The crystal's surface was smooth in some places and rough in others. Tiny fractures spiderwebbed beneath its outer layer, giving it the appearance of something under strain, like it was holding something in. He reached out, but stopped short of touching it. Not superstition. Instinct. A voice in the back of his skull whispered, "Do not." He swallowed and looked around the chamber again. For passages branched out from the dome's walls, 2 on his left, 2 on his right, each carved with the same precision as the chamber itself. Their walls were lined with glowing symbols, faint enough that a careless man could still get lost, but bright enough to guide anyone who knew what to look for. Behind him was the way they came, the old sewer tunnels, darker, wetter, more primitive. And straight ahead beyond the crystal was another passage, a mouth cut into stone. But this one had no markings, no glow. It was just darkness, a pure black throat that swallowed the faint light from the chamber, refusing to give anything back. Joran's eyes lingered on it. He didn't like the idea of stepping into a passage that didn't glow, but he liked it more than staying in a room that did. "Any signs?" he whispered. Liz, posted near his left flank, shook her head slightly, eyes scanning the left passages. The symbols gave her enough illumination to watch shadows, to catch motion at the edges of sight. At least, she thought they did. She shifted her weight carefully, boots silent on the smooth stone. Her gaze lingered on the leftmost passage, one of the glowing ones, studying the way the symbols curved inward like guiding lines. And then she saw it. A silhouette. Not fully stepping into view, just enough shape to break the outline of the tunnel. Her breath stopped. It was wrong. Long arms that hung too low, claw-like fingers that curved inward. Legs too short for its torso, forcing its body into a hunched posture. Its shoulders were narrow but carried a predatory tension like a coiled spring. And its head. The head looked like a man's head at first glance. Until you realized the hair. The hair was styled into 2 horn-like shapes, rising from either side, as if someone had sculpted it deliberately. A mockery of something sacred. Liz blinked once. The silhouette didn't move. Then, as if by accident, it turned its face slightly and locked eyes with her. 2 yellow points burned in the dark, not reflecting light, producing it. Slitted irises like a serpent's. Unblinking. Watching. For a heartbeat, Liz couldn't breathe. Time stretched thin and brittle. Her hand shot out and grabbed Joran's shoulder. Hard. She shook him once, violently, without taking her eyes off the creature. Joran turned sharply, irritated. "What is it?" Then his gaze followed hers. He saw the silhouette. He saw the yellow eyes. And his blood went cold. The creature did not advance. It did not retreat. It simply stared, perfectly still, as if it had been waiting for someone to notice it. Joran's mouth went dry. Don't, he began, but the word died in his throat. Because the creature screamed. Not like a man. Not like an animal. The sound was a jagged thing, high and low at once, as if two voices were layered on top of each other and neither belonged in a human throat. It cut through the chamber like broken glass. The Dark Hounds flinched violently. A few stumbled back. One man nearly loosed an arrow by reflex. A loose arrow did fly. Someone's fingers had slipped, or someone had panicked and released without command. The shaft cut through the glowing air toward the silhouette. Whether it hit or missed, no one could tell. The smoke of panic had already thickened in their minds. The scream stopped abruptly. The chamber held its breath. The yellow eyes remained, unblinking. Then a rumble rolled through the dome. Not the distant siege thunder above. This rumble came from within the stone. It vibrated up through Joran's boots, through his shins, into his spine, as if something beneath them had shifted its weight. The glowing symbols pulsed brighter. Once, twice. The spiral pattern intensified, light surging toward the crystal like blood rushing to a heart. Joran felt a sudden certainty. This chamber was not empty. This chamber was a trigger, and they had just pulled it. His mind snapped into decision. Fight. Here? In this chamber full of unknown symbols and a crystal anchored into melted stone? No. His gut screamed the answer so hard it felt like pain. Run. But where? The glowing passages could lead anywhere. Traps, dead ends, worse. The sewer route behind them was long and filled with predators. Only one passage remained untouched by whatever this place was. The one without markings. The one that swallowed light. Joran didn't think further. He shouted, voice low but sharp, cutting through the echoing chamber. MOVE dark passage. Now. The Dark Hounds reacted instantly. But Joran knew movement alone wasn't enough. They needed to break line of sight. They needed confusion. They needed time. Smoke, he barked. Two men hurled smoke bombs toward the glowing passages left and right, aiming for the tunnel mouths where the markings were strongest. The bomb struck stone and burst. Black smoke erupted violently, thick and choking, rolling across the chamber in waves. It swallowed the glowing symbols, turning the luminous spiral into a dim, drowned pattern beneath darkness. The strange light became muffled. The chamber became blind. Joran grabbed Liz's arm and yanked her toward the unmarked passage. Go, he hissed. Bootsteps hammered against stone, now no longer stealth, only survival. The Dark Hounds sprinted, cloaks flaring behind them, weapons clutched tight. Behind them, the yellow eyes still burned through the smoke like embers that refused to die. And the rumble beneath their feet grew louder. The dark passage swallowed them whole. The chamber behind them glowing spirals, star marks. The crystal like a man-shaped stake in melted stone vanished into the smoke and the pounding in their ears. Joran didn't look back. He didn't dare. They sprinted like hunted animals, boots striking stone in frantic rhythm, breaths tearing out of their throats. The air here was colder than the sewer tunnels, dry in places, sharp with dust, yet it carried a faint, rancid sweetness beneath the sulfur, like spoiled fruit left in a sealed jar too long. The passage itself was not maintained like the glowing corridors. It was broken. Loose rocks littered the floor, stones that shifted and skittered under boots. Debris lay in jagged piles, collapsed supports, fractured masonry, bits of old timber half rotted into the earth. The tunnel walls were raw and uneven, as if this passage had been carved once and then abandoned mid-work, left to the dark to chew. Joran's breath burned. They had ditched the torches back in the chamber, trusting the glowing symbols to light the way. Down here there were no symbols, no guidance, only black. The kind of black that didn't feel like the absence of light. It felt like a presence. Joran slammed his shoulder against the wall to steady himself when a stone rolled beneath his boot. His sword scraped the rough surface, sending a faint spark that died instantly. We need light. Not because light made them safe, but because darkness made them blind. Joran drew his short sword up in front of him and dragged the blade hard against the stone wall as he ran. Steel screamed. Sparks spat in brief bursts. The friction heated the metal fast, the edge glowing faintly, dull red for a heartbeat before the air stole it away. Behind him, the Dark Hounds moved in a tight line, disciplined even in panic. They had a routine for this. Oil. Every Dark Hound weapon carried a thin coat of dark oil. It prevented rust after long marches in rain and swamp. It swallowed light in night raids. And most importantly, it caught flame easily when heated. Joran kept scraping his blade, forcing heat into the metal. His arm vibrated from the strain, forearm burning, but he didn't stop until the blade held warmth like a living thing. Then he reached back and yanked his torch free from the strap on his pack. The torch was wrapped in old cloth and soaked with resin. A prepared tool. A lifeline. He brought the heated blade to the cloth. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then the oil and resin caught. Flame bloomed with a hungry hiss. The torch ignited. Light flared outward, weak at first, then stronger, throwing orange illumination across the jagged tunnel. Their shadows snapped into existence along the walls, stretching and twisting, making every Dark Hound look taller, stranger. Joran didn't feel relief. The torchlight didn't erase the terror. It only revealed how small they were inside this place. He ran harder. We have a mission. He clung to the thought like a rope over a cliff. Bell trusted me to lead this team. To finish what we started. Open the gates. End the war. Get the men home. That was the only thing keeping the fear from consuming him. The only thing keeping the memory of yellow eyes and a scream that wasn't human from crawling up his spine. Ahead, a Dark Hound at the front suddenly stopped. The man moved with practiced precision. He planted his feet, knocked an arrow, and raised his bow toward the darkness behind them. The others didn't slow. They flowed around him, passing his stationary form like water passing a rock. The last man passed. The archer released. The arrow vanished into the black behind them. A heartbeat later. A sound. Not stone. Not wood. A wet impact. Flesh. The archer's eyes widened slightly. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply turned and sprinted forward again, rejoining the column. Joran heard it and felt the icy satisfaction of survival. They did it again. Another man stopped ahead, knocked an arrow, waited for the column to pass, then loosed it into the pursuit behind them. Another wet impact. Another half-heard sound, something like a strangled hiss. The tunnel was narrow and linear. Perfect for it. They could keep slowing whatever followed them, forcing it to pay for every yard. Until the arrows ran out. Joran didn't have time to count how many they had left. He only heard the breathing of his men, the ragged draw of air through teeth, the occasional wheeze of panic. And beneath that, a faint tapping sound. Not their boots. Something else. Like claws touching stone. Fast. Keeping pace. The torchlight shook in Joran's hand as he ran. The shadows behind them looked wrong. Too many. Too long. Flickering shapes that stretched and collapsed with each bounce of the flame. Then Sam moved up. Sam, their marksman. The man who could knock and loose arrows faster than most men could draw breath. A lean figure with a hawk's stare, his quiver always lighter than it should have been because he shot through it so quickly. Sam pushed ahead to the front, taking point. He didn't stop to breathe. He didn't need to. He reached the front and without breaking stride, he turned his body slightly and knocked 4 arrows into his right hand fan between fingers. He looked back once. Not at Joran. At the darkness behind them. Then he planted his feet. The rest of the Dark Hounds rushed past him. Sam drew. Released. 1, 2, 3, 4. The bowstring snapped with vicious speed. The arrows vanished into darkness. Then, a chorus of impacts. Wet. Heavy. Something shrieked. Not a human shriek. Not even like the chamber scream. This was closer. Animal and wrong. Sam's mouth tightened. He reached for more arrows. But he never got them. Because the ceiling moved. Joran didn't notice it at first. None of them did. The torchlight didn't reach the upper curve of the tunnel well enough. The ceiling remained a shifting black dome above them. But something was there. Crawling. Fast. Multiple shapes clinging to stone like spiders. Man-like bodies twisted into unnatural angles. Elongated arms gripping cracks. Claw-like fingers digging into rock. Short legs kicking for purchase. And they moved silently. Until they didn't. One dropped. Right onto Sam. Sam shouted, half a gasp, half a scream as the creature slammed into him with enough force to knock him backward. Another dropped immediately after. Then another, swarming him like a nightmare spilling from the ceiling. Sam tried to raise his bow like a club. He got one desperate strike. Then claws tore into him. Teeth, too many teeth found flesh. His scream echoed down the tunnel, sharp enough to cut through every heartbeat. Joran's eyes widened. Sam. But he couldn't stop. If he stopped, they all died. The column surged forward, boots splashing through small puddles, slipping on loose stones. Sam's scream broke into choking sounds. Then stopped. Liz heard it. The sound did something to her stomach, twisted it, hollowed it. She didn't look back. She ran. Her bow was already in her hands now, arrow half knocked, her fingers trembling with the urge to shoot into the darkness, even though she couldn't see a target. The tunnel twisted ahead. The torchlight revealed scratches in the stone marks like claws had gouged the walls repeatedly, shallow grooves that caught the light in thin silver lines. They were not alone in this place. They never had been. Liz pushed harder, taking the front now. Her breath was too loud in her ears. The torchlight behind her bounced wildly, throwing her shadow forward like a running ghost. She raised her bow, about to stop and loose another delaying arrow because she could still hear something behind them, still hear that claw tapping. And then the passage opened. Suddenly, violently, the tunnel spat them out into a vast opening. Liz skidded to a stop so fast her boots slid on loose gravel. The arrow nearly left her bowstring by accident. Her eyes widened. A cliff. Not a small drop. A massive open space carved out of the earth, the ceiling lost in darkness above, the side sheer rock walls plunging into a void below. And spanning that gap, a bridge. Old. Made of rope and weathered planks. It sagged under its own age, ropes frayed, boards uneven and splintered. It swayed faintly even without anyone stepping on it, as if the cavern breathed and the bridge moved with it. On the other side was another tunnel. But that tunnel looked different. Not sewer stone. Not smooth ceremonial carving. It looked like an engineered mining passage, straight lines, reinforced supports, cut marks in the walls from tools, the faint outline of rails or grooves in the ground where carts might once have rolled. Liz's throat tightened. Joran caught up behind her, torchlight spilling across the bridge. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that gap and the swaying planks. Behind them, a sound, a scraping whisper. Claws on stone. Closer. Joran's voice came out raw. Bridge. Liz swallowed hard. The bridge looked like death, but the tunnel behind them looked like something worse. And the darkness above the cliff opening felt like it was watching. Waiting. Hungry. Joran did not have time to think. That was the worst part. Not the darkness. Not the sounds gathering behind them in the passage. Not even the old rope bridge swaying over a depth the torchlight could not measure. It was the fact that command had left the realm of judgment and entered the realm of instinct. The cavern breathed around them. Cold air rose from the abyss below, dry and mineral-rich, carrying the smell of dust, old stone, and something deeper, something stale, hidden, unopened for generations. The ceiling far above remained unseen, swallowed by blackness. The bridge creaked in slow, complaining groans, each frayed rope strand straining with the memory of weight. Behind them, from the tunnel mouth, came the sound again. A scraping, a skittering, then something like wet feet hitting stone in rapid succession, too many beats too close together, overlapping in a rhythm no human body could make. Joran felt panic crash through him, so hard it hollowed his chest. For left, only four. Himself, Liz, Marco, Jack. The rest of the Dark Hounds had been taken by the tunnel, the sewer, the city, the dark. Sam's scream still lived in the walls behind them. Chad's body still floated somewhere in that black water chamber. The dead had become a trail behind them, a breadcrumb path of failure. Joran's mouth opened. No order came out. He stared at the bridge, then at the tunnel, then back to the bridge. Nothing in his training had prepared him for this. He had learned to read tree lines, to form shield walls, to obey, to endure. Bell had taught him how to move like a hunter. But this was not war. This was being hunted in a place that should not exist. A hand seized his shoulder hard enough to jolt him. Marco. Marco's face, usually softened by his easy concentration and ink-smudged curiosity, looked carved from stone now. In the wavering light his eyes were sharp and furious, not at the creatures in the tunnel, but at Joran. "Look at me," Marco said. Joran did. Marco tightened his grip. "You and Liz Cross." Joran blinked. "What?" "You and Liz Cross," Marco repeated, each word forced like a nail driven into wood. "Jack and I hold them here." "No." Marco shoved him once, not enough to knock him over, but enough to break the paralysis. "Yes." Jack was already moving, broad shoulders squared, bow in hand, face pale but resolved. He had always been physically larger than most men in the company, built like a cooper's son who'd hauled barrels since childhood. In battle he used that size like a tool. Now he stood at the mouth of the cavern, glancing into the tunnel behind them where the skittering and scraping had grown louder. "We need to finish the mission," Marco said. "Open the gate. End the war. Go home." His voice broke slightly on the last word, but only slightly. Joran stared at him. Marco leaned closer, so close Joran could smell the mix of smoke powder and bitter chemical oil clinging to his clothes. "Bell trusted you," Marco said. "Don't make me die for a fool." That struck. Harder than fear. Joran swallowed. He wanted to argue. Wanted to say no. They crossed together. They fight together, they live together. But the sounds in the tunnel were closer now. More numerous. A chorus of chittering breaths and talons against stone. There was no time left for impossible plans. Liz, Joran said, his voice rough. She turned toward him, bow still in hand, eyes wide and glassy with shock. Across, he ordered. She didn't move. Joran forced strength into his voice. Now. Jack loosed an arrow into the tunnel. The shaft vanished into darkness. A wet, leathery impact followed. Then a shriek that wasn't human and wasn't animal, either something in between, or worse, something beyond both. Marco and Jack began firing in rhythm. One arrow, then another, then another. They couldn't see what they were hitting, but the sounds told them enough. Flesh, hide, claws scraping frantically against stone, a body tumbling into another body. They were slowing them. For now. Liz bit her lip so hard Joran saw blood on it in the torchlight. Then she turned and stepped onto the bridge. The first plank groaned under her weight. The second cracked. Not fully, just enough to make the sound of old wood remembering how to break. The rope bridge swayed violently over the abyss. Below it, darkness swallowed everything. The torchlight could not find the bottom. It only lit fragments of drifting dust and the faintest suggestion of distant rock faces dropping away into nothing. Liz crossed slowly, boots careful on the warped planks, one hand gripping the rope railing, bow slung across her back. Every step produced a small shudder that ran through the bridge into the stone anchors at either side. Joran placed the torch on the ground and drew his own bow. His fingers moved from habit more than thought. For arrows came into his hand at once, fanned between knuckles, the way Bell had drilled into them until muscle memory became law. He turned toward the tunnel mouth. Drew. Released. The arrows vanished into the dark. A flurry of sounds answered one impact, two, then a third that sounded like a shaft punching into something wet and hollow. And then the tunnel erupted. Not with voices. With life. Bats burst from the darkness first, shrieking as they poured into the cavern in a black, fluttering cloud, slamming into walls and each other, thrown into panic by whatever came behind them. Smaller nocturnal creatures followed, pale cave lizards, rat things with hairless tails, insects disturbed from crevices that hadn't known daylight in centuries. And beneath their frantic movement came the real sound. The thunder of rapid crawling. The slap of inhuman feet. The scratch of many jointed limbs dragging themselves into speed. Joran's skin crawled. On the other side of the bridge, Liz reached the far ledge and turned, her voice carrying thinly through the cavern. I'm across. Joran nodded once, slinging the bow over his shoulder. He snatched up the torch and stepped onto the bridge. It sagged under him immediately. Every plank seemed to complain at once. The ropes creaked like old bones. Beneath his boots the wood flexed, brittle with age, blackened by moisture and rot. He moved as fast as he dared, which was not fast at all. Behind him, Jack's arrows stopped. Joran looked back over his shoulder. Jack had run out. The quiver at his side hung empty. The creatures had reached the mouth of the cavern, now half-seen shapes in the flickering light, hunchbacked and wrong, their long arms ending in segmented talons that clicked and scraped as they lunged. Their eyes flashed yellow in clusters, like embers suspended in black flesh. Jack threw aside his useless bow and grabbed Marco's small shield along with his own. Then he planted himself in the tunnel mouth. The opening was narrow enough for two men side by side, barely. Jack's size became a wall. He jammed both shields outward, one angled high, one low, sealing the entrance with his body behind them. The first creature hit him hard enough to make the shields ring. Then another. Then several at once. Talons hooked over the shield rims. Claws scraped wood. A segmented arm, two mini joints bending in the wrong direction, reached over and tore across Jack's shoulder. He roared and shoved back. Marco had dropped to one knee behind him. His hands moved quickly over his satchel contents, selecting powders, grains, pastes with the desperate focus of a man measuring his own death. Black powder, silver-flecked sand, bronze-colored pebbled compounds, a tar-thick substance in a waxed pouch. He dumped them together into a metal dish and mixed furiously with a spatula, the smell turning sharp and metallic in the air. Sulfur bit at the nose. Something acidic followed. Then a bitter sweetness that made Joran's eyes water. Jack grunted. A talon punched through one of the shields and raked across his back. Blood sprayed in dark streaks over the stone. Another arm came through, then another. Multiple jointed limbs clawed at him from the shadows, opening cuts and gouges across his shoulders, spine, and ribs. His back became a ruin of torn cloth and wet flesh, but still he held. Still he pressed himself into the opening and denied them the cavern. Marco kept mixing. The contents of the dish changed texture, thickening into a clay-like black mass that smoked faintly in the cold air. Without hesitation, he began packing it into the housings of the smoke bombs remaining at his belt, pressing it in with his thumbs until each sphere bulged slightly. Jorn was halfway across the bridge now. The planks beneath him broke one by one, not collapsing fully, but splitting under his weight and forcing him to jump, step, catch rope, keep moving. The bridge swung harder with every shift, the abyss below yawning open like a mouth. He glanced back again. Jack was dying. It was obvious now. His shields trembled. His knees were beginning to bend. Blood ran freely down the backs of his legs. Marco looked up and saw Jorn watching. For a moment, in the wavering torchlight, Marco smiled. Not happily, just knowingly. Then he rose with the modified bombs clutched in both hands. Jack gave one final shove, a wordless roar exploding from his chest as he drove his weight forward into the tunnel mouth and crushed something there. But the creatures were too many. Talons hooked around his shield. More arms found gaps. Something tore into his side. Jack staggered. The wall was breaking. Marco lit the bombs. One fuse, then another, then the rest. Sparks hissed. He sprinted toward the tunnel mouth. Jorn shouted something, he didn't even know what, but the words vanished into the cavern. Marco stopped beside Jack, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the shields. Then he shouted, voice carrying across the abyss to the bridge. Tell Bell. His gaze never left the tunnel. The hunt is worth it. The creatures surged. Marco grinned like a man stepping into fire by choice. Dark Hounds die, he roared. His voice rose one last time, ragged, triumphant, defiant. But we never fail the hunt. Then the world became light. The explosion tore the cavern apart. It was not a clean blast. It was a violent, choking eruption of fire, pressure, and shattered stone. The tunnel mouth vanished in a bloom of black-red flame. The shockwave slammed into the cavern walls and threw dust, splinters, and rock in every direction. Jorn felt the bridge jump beneath him. The ropes snapped like giant bowstrings. The planks beneath his feet disintegrated. He ran. One desperate step, then another. Then there was no bridge at all. Only air. He jumped. For one impossible heartbeat, he was suspended over the abyss, torch tumbling away from his hand, heat from the explosion on his back, darkness opening beneath him. He didn't make it. Liz screamed his name and threw herself to the edge, arm outstretched. Too far. Jorn fell short, but his hand closed on something. Rope. One of the bridge's sidelines, half snapped and whipping free. The jolt nearly ripped his shoulder out of its socket. The rope burned through his palm as his full weight hit it. Below him, broken planks fell and vanished into the dark. The rope groaned. Old. Frayed. Dying. Jorn swung once against the cliff face and slammed into stone hard enough to knock the breath from him. Pain flashed through his ribs. The rope would not hold. He knew it instantly. With one hand, he clung to it. With the other, he tore his dagger free and drove it into the cliff. The blade bit between cracks in the rock. He used it like a climbing pick, dragging himself close enough to press his body against the stone. Above, Liz was already pulling a spare rope from her pack with shaking hands. Hurry, she shouted. Her voice broke. Hurry. Jorn's fingers were going numb. The old bridge rope snapped strand by strand, each tiny pop louder than thunder in his ears. Liz dropped the new rope. It smacked the cliff face beside him, swung once, then settled within reach. Jorn let go of the dying bridge line and caught the new rope with both hands. For one horrifying second, he hung free over the abyss. Then he began to climb. Every pull sent knives through his ribs and shoulders. His boots scraped uselessly against smooth rock. Dust and grit rained into his eyes. Above him, Liz braced herself flat on the ledge, both hands wrapped around the rope, heels dug into stone. Jorn climbed because there was no alternative. Because Marco and Jack were gone. Because Bell had trusted him. Because survival was now the only way to make any of this mean something. When he finally reached the ledge, Liz grabbed his arm and hauled with a strength born of panic. Jorn rolled onto the cold stone and lay there, flat on his back, lungs dragging in ragged breaths. The cavern behind them was collapsing. Dust clouds boiled through the air. Fragments of rock still fell from above. The opening where the bridge had once anchored was now a broken scar in the cliff. Jorn stared at the dark ceiling he still could not see. His whole body shook. Beside him, Liz dropped to her knees, chest heaving. Neither of them spoke. The stone beneath them was cold. The air smelled of dust, sulfur, and burned chemicals. And somewhere beyond the collapse, the things in the dark were either buried or not.
Like and subscribe for more Danmachi fanfiction.
Chapter 9. The Fall of Blackhaven. The night above Blackhaven had become a storm of stone and fire. Trebuchets from the ridges of Tharvess groaned like tortured beasts as their counterweights slammed downward again and again. Each release hurled another screaming boulder across the night sky. The projectiles cut through the darkness like falling stars before crashing into the ancient districts of the city. The air trembled with every launch. Wooden frames shrieked under strain. Chains rattled. The deep whump of the sling release rolled outward across the hills like thunder. Moments later came the impact. The projectile struck with bone-breaking violent stone, meeting stone in catastrophic bursts of sound that echoed through the night like the cracking of mountains. One such boulder smashed into a merchant block near the eastern quarter. The entire street vanished in a single violent instant. Masonry exploded outward in a cloud of shattered granite. Arched windows burst apart. Timber beams snapped like dry twigs. Dust surged upward in choking gray waves while broken roof tiles clattered down the surrounding streets. Fire followed. Oil lamps, overturned by the impact, spilled flaming pitch across wooden floors. Curtains ignited. Market cloth and spice racks caught flame in hungry orange tongues that crawled rapidly from stall to stall. The heat swelled quickly. Smoke rose thick and greasy into the night, carrying the bitter scent of burning cedar, scorched cloth, spilled wine, and something darker beneath it, charred flesh. The rumble of destruction rolled across the city like distant thunder. Blackhaven had stood for centuries. Tonight it was bleeding. From the highest point of the city, the towering citadel of the Karsic Council, the devastation could be seen clearly. Grand Consul Kashin stood upon the wide marble balcony overlooking the burning streets below. The balcony projected from the citadel like the prow of a stone ship. Its carved parapets etched with the ancient sigils of the Karsic Confederacy, interlocking crowns, ledgers, and the stylized compass that had once symbolized the Confederacy's dominion over trade routes across half the continent. Tonight, those carvings glowed red in the reflected firelight. Wind tugged at Kashin's long dark cloak, snapping the heavy fabric against his legs as the night carried with it the scent of smoke, burning pitch, and the bitter metallic tang of blood drifting up from the streets. Below him, the city was unraveling. District after district burned beneath the relentless assault of Tharvess siege engines. Entire blocks had collapsed into smoking craters where trebuchet stones had struck. Towers once proud and defiant were now jagged silhouettes against the red glow of flame, their upper floors shattered or sagging inward. The eastern walls, once considered unassailable, had already been breached from within. The gates had opened. Kashin's fingers tightened against the cold stone parapet until the knuckles turned pale. The marble beneath his hand was chilled by the night air, slick with fine dust drifting down from the burning districts. Tiny fragments of ash landed softly across the balcony like gray snow. The city should have held. Blackhaven was not some frontier stronghold hastily built from timber and earth. It was a fortress city carved from obsidian and granite. Its walls were layered with centuries of reinforcement. Its towers commanded every approach. Its armies were disciplined and numerous. Even the greatest kings of the north had failed to breach it. And yet, the Tharvess army now flooded through the eastern gate like a black tide. From Kashin's vantage, he could see them moving through the streets in dense formations, torchlight flickering across shields and helmets as they pushed deeper into the city. Kashin exhaled slowly through his nose. Impossible, he muttered. His sharp eyes scanned the burning districts. Tharvess banners were already rising from rooftops and watchtowers. The silver wolf of Tharvess fluttered where the sigil of Karsic had flown only hours before. This was no simple breach. This was a collapse. Someone had opened that gate. Someone had betrayed the Confederacy. Kashin's jaw tightened. His mind began assembling possibilities the way a strategist assembled pieces upon a board. A general bribed. A gate captain compromised. Mercenaries inside the walls. Or perhaps something worse. His thoughts were interrupted by the heavy slam of a chambered door behind him. Boots struck marble. A soldier rushed onto the balcony and dropped to one knee. Grand Consul. Kashin turned slowly. The soldier's armor bore the crimson stripe of the inner citadel guard. His helmet was missing, revealing sweat-soaked hair plastered against his skull and a face streaked with soot and dried blood. His chest heaved as he struggled to steady his breathing. "What news?" Kashin asked calmly. The soldier lowered his head. "Tharvess forces have seized the eastern districts. Several towers along the inner wall have fallen. They are advancing toward the citadel." The words echoed hollowly against the marble walls. The soldier continued. "Our commanders still hold portions of the inner walls, but the enemy grows stronger by the hour. You must evacuate immediately, Grand Consul." We cannot guarantee your safety here. Kashin stared past him toward the burning city. Even now the thunder of siege stones continued. A distant impact sent a faint tremor through the balcony floor. Somewhere below, men were screaming. He asked only one question. The treasury. The soldier straightened slightly. It has been transferred, Grand Consul. Kashin turned his head. To the crown ledger? Yes, Grand Consul. For the first time that night, Kashin smiled. The crown ledger. The greatest vessel ever constructed by the Karsic shipyards. Faster than any merchant vessel. Heavily reinforced. Capable of outrunning most naval pursuit. Within its hold lay the accumulated wealth of the Confederacy gold, ledgers, treaties, seals of authority, and the royal archives that legitimized their rule. If Blackhaven fell, the Confederacy could simply rise elsewhere. Kashin turned away from the balcony. Then we leave. The soldier nodded quickly. This way, Grand Consul. They moved swiftly through the citadel's interior halls. The once pristine corridors were now filled with the distant echoes of battle. Steel rang faintly somewhere below. A man shouted. Another voice screamed. The war had reached the lower courtyards. Torchlight flickered along the stone walls as Kashin's escort led him toward a heavy iron door concealed behind a tapestry. The tapestry was pulled aside. The door opened. Beyond it lay a narrow stone passage descending into darkness. The smell hit immediately. Dust. Old stone. Cobwebs. A damp, earthy odor that had not seen fresh air in decades. Rats scurried along the edges of the tunnel as the soldiers lit torches and began descending. Their claws scratched rapidly against the stone as they fled the sudden light. The passage twisted sharply, then twisted again. These tunnels had been carved during the earliest construction of Blackhaven's secret escape routes known only to the highest council members. Their layout was deliberately confusing, designed to frustrate pursuers. But Kashin knew every turn, every branch, every hidden mechanism. He had memorized the route decades ago. Their boots echoed hollowly against ancient stone as they moved deeper beneath the city. Above them the war continued. Distant tremors from trebuchet impacts vibrated faintly through the earth overhead. Occasionally dust drifted from the ceiling in thin gray streams. Eventually the tunnel began rising again. Kashin stopped beside a stone lever built into the wall. "Pull it," he ordered. A guard obeyed. Stone groaned. A section of the ceiling shifted upward with a grinding rumble. Dust fell as a concealed trapdoor opened above them. Cool night air drifted down. Kashin climbed first. He emerged into a dimly lit warehouse. The storehouse near the docks. Exactly as it had been designed. Rows of wooden racks lined the interior walls. Supply crates were stacked along the sides, food reserves, spare weapons, medical supplies. Or at least they should have been. Kashin stepped forward. Something felt wrong. The warehouse was empty. Not partially empty. Completely empty. The racks stood bare. The crates were gone. The floor where the Crown Ledger's supply manifest had once been stacked was nothing but bare wood. Kashin's breath caught. No. He walked forward slowly. The great warehouse doors stood open. Beyond them lay the docks. The cold sea air carried the sound of waves slapping against empty moorings. Kashin stumbled out onto the cobblestone dock. The harbor stretched before him. Dark. Silent. Empty. The Crown Ledger was gone. The ship had already sailed. Even if he took a smaller vessel now, he could never catch it. The realization struck him like a blade through the chest. His legs weakened. Kashin sank slowly to his knees upon the cold cobblestones of the harbor. The stone was damp beneath his palms. Above the city, flames continued to rise. Behind him, the armies of Tharvess surged deeper into Blackhaven. The Confederacy's greatest fortress was dying. And now, its master had been left behind. At the inner walls, Blackhaven had not yet died, but it was bleeding from too many wounds to hide it. The Tharvess army had already swallowed the outer districts, seizing barracks, watch posts, granaries, and every military structure that could be turned from shield into spear. Smoke rolled through the city in bruised black columns, climbing into the night sky, where sparks drifted like dying stars. Roofs burned. Alleyways choked. Bells rang from shattered towers, some by desperate hands, others because falling stone had jarred old iron tongues into frightened song. And beyond all that ruin rose the inner walls, the last true defense of Blackhaven. They stood behind the conquered city like a second spine shorter than the outer obsidian curtain, but thicker in the places that mattered, strengthened with inward slanting battlements, murder slits, and tower junctions designed to make any advance into a slaughter. Their gates were heavy oak bound with iron ribs. Not legendary, not impossible, but strong enough to buy time. Time was what Rexer meant to sell with blood, and time was what Darius intended to steal. Darius Cranel stood in the upper level of a ruined market structure overlooking the open stretches near the inner walls. The building had once housed silk traders and moneylenders. Now its upper gallery was charred timber, cracked tile, and drifting ash. One side of the roof had collapsed inward, leaving a jagged opening through which moonlight and fireglow mingled in dirty orange streaks. He watched from behind a broken stone column. Below, the streets between the market district and the inner wall had become a graveyard of debris-smashed carts, collapsed stalls, dead horses, dropped shields, broken ladders, severed limbs cooling in the soot. Smoke curled low over cobblestones slick with blood and water from burst cisterns. The smell was thick: scorched timber, hot pitch, open guts, damp ash, and the metallic bite of fresh killing. Darius's face did not change. He had seen too many cities die to flinch at another. Around him, his elite mercenaries and soldiers waited in disciplined silence. They wore no bright heraldry, only muted leather, chain, and darkened steel under ash-streaked cloaks. Men moved in crouched shapes between cracked walls and burned archways, communicating by gesture and whistle rather than voice. Darius had already taken what Blackhaven had built to defend itself. Two nearby Karsic towers in the residential district set just outside the inner walls to create overlapping fields of fire were now occupied by his men. The city planners had designed them so defenders could rake invaders with bolts, stones, and fire from elevated angles before they ever reached the second gate. A good design. Good enough that Darius intended to use it against its makers. He studied the inner gate. Rexer had done what any disciplined commander would do. The remaining Scorpion's heavy torsion engines mounted along the inner wall had been hauled into place and re-aimed toward the approaches. Crews strained at their winches under shouted orders, arms slick with sweat, faces blackened by smoke. The great bow arms of the engines creaked under tension, ready to hurl iron bolts through plate, horse, and flesh alike. Men with shield walls formed below them. Archers knelt in rows between gaps in the stone teeth of the parapets. Rexer himself stood above the gatehouse in dark armor, red sash visible even at distance, sword naked in his hand. A commander not hiding from the fall of his city. Darius respected that. He still intended to break him. He turned slightly and looked toward the towers his men had taken. There. A torch flame flashed twice at the eastern residential tower. Then once, steady. Signal complete. The first team was ready. Moments later, a second torch answered from the tower nearer the temple square. Both teams had finished. Darius narrowed his eyes and allowed himself one slow breath. The towers had once been fitted with heavy city engine stone throwers and oil hurlers meant for defensive arcs. But his men had not wasted the opportunity. They had brought up the iron throats. The weapons were not common. Not yet. Not true artillery as later ages would understand it, but something uglier and more temperamental: short cast iron bombards forged in secret workshops of Tharvess and paid for with northern ore and king's paranoia. They were squat, thick-barreled monsters mounted on reinforced timber beds banded with iron. Each piece was too heavy to manhandle without block, lever, and obscene amounts of swearing. Yet they had been moved. By ropes. By pulleys. By capstans ripped from siege wagons. By brute force and blood. Darius had watched part of it earlier. Men straining shoulder to shoulder in alley smoke, boots slipping in blood, hands blistering as they hauled one bombard up the interior ramp of a tower built never to receive such a weapon. Carpenters had sawed away portions of the parapet. Masons knocked loose stone embrasures with sledges. Iron wedges were hammered beneath wheels. Timber braces were fitted under the rear bed to absorb recoil. It had taken 20 men and nearly cost them 3. But now the bombard sat in place. Each loaded with a single iron-shod stone core wrapped in scrap chain and lead splinter shot, a bastard ammunition designed not for range, but for rupture. Around the charge chamber, the gunners had packed a powder mixture Marco would have admired. Brown charcoal, yellow sulfur, salt crystal refined from nitrates scraped and leached from old stables and midden walls. Then strengthened with alchemical grains from Tharvess workshop, small gray-blue pebbles that burned hotter and faster than common powder, though never predictably. Dangerous, expensive, effective. The gunners called it King's Thunder. Darius called it enough. Inside the eastern residential tower, 5 of his loyal men worked in the half-dark around the bombard's iron mouth. Dex wiped soot from his brow with the back of a shaking wrist. Alamun crouched beside the rear wedge, checking the angle again by lantern slit. Stein and Dust held the carriage ropes tight, while Finn drove a final iron spike into the floor braces with 3 hard blows of a hammer. The entire tower room smelled of hot metal, charred rope, pitch resin, and the sour sweat of fear. Again, Dex said. Alamon sighted down the stubby barrel toward the inner gate through the widened parapet cut. From this angle the gatehouse sat partly shielded by the square, but the hinge-side timbers and lower braces were visible. "It'll hold the line," Alamon muttered. "If the recoil doesn't throw the throat through us first." Dust spat black saliva. "Helpful." Finn pressed a slow match to life from a shielded lantern, the treated cord glowing dull orange and trailing bitter smoke. Stein tightened the last rope and stepped back. "When the signal comes, no delay." No one answered. The bombard sat like a chained beast, iron skin sweating heat from the packed chamber within. Across the district, the second tower made ready as well. Darius saw both torches steady. He raised his hand. One of his runners crouched behind him in the ruined market, lifted a polished metal mirror plate to catch firelight from below and flashed the agreed signal toward the towers. Once. Twice. Fire. In the tower, Dex took the match from Finn. His hand was steady now. "No prayers." Dust muttered. Dex touched the glowing cord to the vent. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the tower became thunder. The bombard roared with a sound too large for its chamber. Flame burst from the muzzle in a white-orange fist. The entire tower shook as if kicked by a giant. Smoke exploded inward and outward together. The recoil slammed the timber bed backward into its braces hard enough to crack one support beam. The projectile screamed through the square. A half-breath later, the second tower fired. The inner gate vanished beneath impact. The first shot hit low, smashing through outer planking and iron bands in a burst of splinters, chain, and pulverized oak. The second struck higher and slightly off-center, shattering the already compromised brace crossbeam and blowing one leaf of the gate inward off its pins. The sound rolled through Blackhaven like judgment. Rexer saw it happen. From the gatehouse parapet, he felt the first blow through his boots, then saw the gate deform like something alive receiving a mortal wound. Iron ribs bowed inward, would burst apart. Men behind the leaves were thrown backward by the shock, some crushed by flying timbers, others ripped open by chainshot fragments that scythed through shield and gut alike. The second hit finished it. The right gate leaf tore loose in a cloud of splinters and black smoke, collapsing inward across the threshold. The left hung crooked, broken from its lower brace and groaning under its own ruin. For a fraction of a second, silence lived in Rexer's head. Not in the city, never in the city, but in the place where denial died. The inner gate was gone. He had known it was weaker than the outer obsidian curtain. Knew it had been built to delay, not endure an army already inside the city. Still, he had hoped to hold long enough for the council to escape, long enough for the treasury and the ledgers and the line of Karsic authority to slip away by sea. Hope, he realized, had become a poor military tool. Shields forward. Rexer roared, voice cutting through shock. The Karsic defenders surged to obey. Scorpions fired. The first iron bolt punched through two charging Tharvess men and pinned a third by the shoulder to the broken gate timber. Archers released in disciplined waves, their shafts descending into the breach as silhouettes appeared through the smoke. Then the Tharvess army came through. Not cautiously, not heroically, like floodwater. Shielded infantry, first tight ranks bristling with spears, stepping over the dead gatekeepers and climbing across the wreckage with mud, ash, and blood already on their boots. Behind them came swordsmen, mercenaries, and heavy axemen eager for close work in the narrowing kill zone. Officers shouted themselves hoarse, trying to preserve order in the crush. Darius moved with them now, not at the front, but just behind the first assault line where a commander could still shape the blow. He drew his sword. "Push," he shouted. "Archers, shoot the defenders on the walls. Don't choke the breach." His men obeyed instantly. The lead Tharvess ranks did not simply pour inward. They split at his signal, one branch driving straight into the broken threshold, while the other wheeled toward the interior stair lines beneath the wall, seeking to gut the defenders from below before the scorpions could be reloaded. Rexer met them in the gate mouth. His first strike took a Tharvess soldier in the face, splitting nose and teeth in a spray of blood. His second cut hacked through a spear shaft, then reversed into the neck of the man behind it. Around him, Karsic soldiers fought with the desperation of men who knew retreat no longer existed. They used wall discipline well. Shields overlapped. Spearmen thrust through lanes. Archers shot point blank until the melee swallowed their targets and forced them to drop bows for knives. Boiling sand and lamp oil, prepared for just this moment, came down from murder slits in smoking curtains that flayed skin and set cloaks aflame. A Tharvess axeman reached the breach and took a scorpion bolt through the chest, so hard it spun him around before he fell. Another climbed over him, roaring, only to lose his arm at the elbow to a Karsic falchion. The inner gate became a butcher's throat. Men slipped in blood and were trampled. Teeth shattered on shield rims. Hands were chopped from wrists still gripping weapons. A young Karsic noble in polished armor drove his sword into one mercenary's mouth and died the next heartbeat with 3 spearheads under his ribs. A Tharvess sergeant lost an eye to a thrown hook blade and kept fighting until a mace collapsed his skull. The smell became unbearable. Hot blood, burned hair, open bowels, black powder smoke drifting from the bombard's shots and mixing with oil fire until every breath tasted of iron and sulfur. From the towers, Darius's men reloaded one bombard for a second shot, though the process was slower, now sponging the hot chamber, ramming powder, seeding another bastard round, praying the weakened braces would survive another firing. But by then the breach had widened enough that another shot might kill as many of their own as the enemy. Darius judged it and let the first assault carry the work. He stepped into the outer edge of the melee, killed a man with one thrust beneath the arm, then shoved a dying body forward to wedge open fighting space for the soldiers behind him. "Keep the pressure on, men," he barked. "Do not pause. If they can breathe, they can fight." Across the broken threshold, Rexer heard him and understood the kind of commander he faced. This was no noble playing at war. This was a butcher with discipline. Rexer spat blood, adjusted his stance, and gave ground only one step at a time, trading men for moments. Moments for a chance that somewhere, somehow, Karsic authority had already escaped him. Above them, another trebuchet stone from the outer siege finally found one of the inner towers by blind fortune. The impact shook the wall. Masonry cracked. A plume of dust and shattered obsidian rained over the slaughter beneath. And still the men of both banners fought on, knee-deep in ruin, because in that hour there was nothing else left for them to be.
Like and subscribe for more Danmachi fanfiction.
Chapter 10. Dawn over Blackhaven. Dawn finally came. It arrived slowly, like a quiet promise after a long nightmare. The first light of morning crept over the horizon beyond the sea, pale and soft. Its golden rays stretched across the rooftops of Blackhaven, touching towers, streets, and broken walls alike. For hours the city had been wrapped in darkness lit only by fire, torchlight, and the red glow of war. Now the sunlight scattered across everything. It revealed the truth. The siege engines of Tharvess had finally fallen silent. The great trebuchets that had roared through the night now stood motionless on the ridges outside the city, their long arms hanging like tired limbs after hours of violence. Inside the city, the fighting had stopped. The once mighty fortress of Blackhaven had changed. The black obsidian walls that had stood for centuries were now scarred with cracks and burn marks. Towers that once watched over trade routes and harbors were broken or leaning. Many homes had collapsed into piles of timber and stone. Half the city burned. Half the city lay in ruin. And the other half carried the marks of battle. Smoke drifted slowly through the streets as small fires continued to burn. Ash floated through the morning air like gray snow. The smell of charred wood, burned cloth, and blood lingered heavily in the wind. Then the bells began to ring. Not the frantic alarm bells of war, but the deep, steady toll of victory. The great bells of Blackhaven's towers echoed across the city. Their voices rolled through the ruined districts, through the harbor, through the markets, and through the broken walls. Citizens and soldiers alike paused. They looked up. High above the city, new banners were rising. The silver wolf of the Tharvess Empire now hung from towers where the sigil of Karsic had flown only the night before. The war was over. The city had fallen. Throughout the streets, Tharvess soldiers moved carefully among the destruction. Some worked to put out fires using buckets drawn from wells and cisterns. Others cleared fallen beams from roads so wagons could pass. Groups of wounded soldiers, both Tharvess and Karsic, sat along the edges of streets while medics wrapped wounds in cloth stained red. The groans of injured men could be heard everywhere. Some cried quietly. Others simply stared at the ground, too tired to speak. Nearby, long rows of surrendered Karsic soldiers stood with their weapons stacked in piles beside them. Their armor was battered and blackened from smoke. Many had cuts across their faces or arms. But they stood quietly. They knew the battle was lost. A Tharvess officer walked slowly past them, watching carefully but without cruelty. His men guarded the prisoners but did not strike them. The war had ended. There was no need for more killing. In the harbor district, sailors lowered damaged masts and repaired ships that had been struck by debris from the siege. Some vessels had burned through the night. their black skeletons now floating in the water like ghosts of the battle. Civilians slowly emerged from cellars and hidden rooms where they had spent the night in fear. Mothers carried children through the streets while elderly merchants leaned on walking sticks, staring at the destruction around them. Blackhaven had been one of the richest cities in the region. Now it looked like a wounded giant. The bells continued to toll. Victory for Tharvess. The citadel of Karsic. High above the broken city stood the grand Karsic citadel. Its black stone towers still rose proudly above the ruins below, though smoke and battle had stained its walls. The great bronze gates of the citadel courtyard now stood open, guarded by soldiers wearing the colors of Tharvess. Inside the citadel halls, the sounds of war had faded into heavy silence. The marble floors were no longer spotless. Boot prints mixed with dried blood marked the once perfect stone. Broken spears and fallen shields lay pushed against the walls where soldiers had fought earlier in the night. The air inside the citadel smelled of smoke, sweat, iron, and death. Through the massive front doors walked three men: William of Tharvess, Commander Griffith, and Commander Darius. Their boots echoed through the wide halls as they moved deeper into the heart of the building. Behind them, small groups of Tharvess soldiers followed, clearing bodies from the floor and dragging broken furniture aside. The interior of the citadel was breathtaking even after the battle. Tall stone columns rose toward a ceiling painted with golden patterns that told the history of Karsic victories. Large banners hung from iron hooks along the walls, each one embroidered with bright thread and gold lining. Symbols of wealth and power filled the hall. Carved statues of past consuls. Decorated shields from allied nations. Tall windows framed with polished marble. But now the beauty of the hall was stained by war. Blood streaked across the floors. Broken armor lay beside fallen soldiers who had died defending the citadel. Some of the Tharvess soldiers walking behind William were wounded themselves. One man walked with his arm tied tightly against his chest. Another limped badly, leaning on the shoulder of a companion. Everyone was tired. The night had been long. Too many men had died. At the end of the great hall stood the seal seat, the throne of the Grand Consul. It had been carved from a single block of black stone long ago. The seat itself was wide and heavy, designed to represent the strength of the Karsic Confederacy. In its center was the symbol of the council: three metal rings joined together. Trade, alliance, commonwealth. The power of Karsic had been built upon those three promises. Now the banners surrounding the throne were torn. One had fallen completely, lying across the steps like a broken flag. William stepped forward slowly. He looked around the hall, at the fallen bodies, at the broken banners, at the blood that stained the once proud chamber. The air felt heavy with defeat. Then William spoke calmly. Replace them. The soldiers behind him immediately began their work. They climbed ladders and cut down the banners of Karsic. One by one, the old symbols were lowered. In their place rose the banners of Tharvess. The silver wolf unfurled above the throne. Its cloth moved gently in the morning air flowing through the broken windows. The citadel now belonged to a new power. The war for Blackhaven had ended. But the cost of victory was written in blood across every stone of the city. The bells of Blackhaven still rang. Their deep bronze voices rolled through the broken city and entered the grand citadel like ghosts invited into a funeral hall. Each toll seemed slower now, heavier, no longer the cry of battle but the measured sound of something ancient being buried. Inside the chamber of the seal seat, the air was thick with the smell of smoke, wet stone, old blood, and sweat dried into cloth after a night without rest. The marble floor, once polished enough to reflect candlelight like still water, was now streaked with mud, boot marks, and dark smears where bodies had been dragged away. Torn banners lay piled against the walls, their gold-threaded emblems trampled into ruin beneath iron boots. At the center of it all sat William Tharvess. He had claimed the seal seat. The black stone throne seemed larger now that it held a conqueror instead of a consul. Its hard obsidian surface had been inlaid with bright metal rings representing the old Karsic principles: trade, alliance, commonwealth, but now those symbols seemed cold and emptied of meaning, as though the throne itself had not yet decided whether it still belonged to the dead order or had submitted to the living one. William sat with measured stillness. His armor had been cleaned as best as war allowed. The gilded trims still caught the morning light spilling through the broken high windows, though soot marked the lower edges and dried blood stained one gauntlet. He did not lounge this time. He sat upright, composed, one hand resting upon the arm of the throne, the other over his knee. This was no longer battlefield command. This was theater. This was law wearing conquest's face. To his right stood Griffith, silver-armored and immaculate as ever, though the hems of his cloak were now touched by ash. His face was calm, pale, unreadable. He looked less like a soldier than a sculpted idea victory made flesh and given silence. To William's left stood Darius, broad-shouldered and scarred, his practical armor still bearing the grime of the breach. He looked out of place amid the gold and stone grandeur, but not lesser. If William embodied authority and Griffith embodied design, Darius stood like the iron fact beneath both. War had made this chamber possible. The great doors of the hall groaned open. For Tharvess, soldiers entered, dragging chains behind them. The sound echoed sharply through the chamber. Rexer came first. The Karsic commander barely remained on his feet. His black armor had been torn open in several places. One pauldron hung loose, his chest plate split at the ribs where some heavy strike had nearly opened him. Blood had dried dark beneath the iron. One leg dragged slightly, and every step looked like an act of refusal rather than strength. His face was bruised, beard clotted with blood, one eye swollen nearly shut. Yet even now, broken as he was, he held something of command in the way he carried his pain. Behind him came Cashin. The Grand Consul no longer looked like inevitability robed in white. His black cloak was ripped and soaked at the hem with harbor mud. The white robes that once marked him as the highest voice of the Karsic Confederacy were torn, smeared with soot, blood, and grime. One sleeve had been split nearly to the elbow. His hair, once precisely arranged, now hung loose and damp across his brow. Still, his posture resisted humiliation. Even in chains, even half-dragged by foreign soldiers into his own council hall, Cashin did not look small. He looked like a fallen standard refusing to touch the ground. The soldiers forced both men down before the throne. Chains rattled. Knees struck marble. One soldier shoved Rexer between the shoulders hard enough to pitch him forward. Another gripped Cashin by the arm and drove him into a prostrated posture at a measured distance from the seal seat. Behind them, a full platoon of Tharvess soldiers formed in ordered silence. Spears upright, shields polished, helms forward. Not just guards. A statement. The chamber held its breath. Then William spoke. His voice carried cleanly through the hall, sharpened not by shouting, but by certainty. Let it be witnessed, he said, by those present in this chamber, by the banners raised above these walls, and by the bells of Blackhaven itself, that the war between the Karsic Confederacy and the Kingdom of Tharvess is concluded. The words settled over the room like stone blocks laid into place. William did not look at Griffith. He did not look at Darius. He looked only at the two men kneeling below him. By right of conquest, he continued, by breach of the Eastern Gate, by occupation of the city's military structures, by the surrender of its standing battalions, and by the taking of this citadel, the authority of Karsic over Blackhaven has ended. Rexer lowered his head, not in submission, but because holding it upright had become too costly. Cashin did not move. William extended one hand. A clerk stepped forward from the side of the chamber carrying a lacquered case. He opened it carefully and withdrew a thick ledger bound in dark leather, along with a smaller box of seals and ink. William's gaze remained fixed on Cashin. As Grand Consul, he said, you will now confirm the transfer of authority. You will surrender the council seals. You will acknowledge the capitulation of the Confederacy's seat at Blackhaven, and you will affix your hand and seal to the ledger of transfer. The clerk approached slowly, holding the ledger as though carrying a relic. William's tone hardened only slightly. By the documented testimony of King Marcus Tharvess, and by the witnessed right of victorious claim, I offer you one lawful mercy. Submit, and preserve what remains of your people. He leaned forward. Refuse and die with the Confederacy. Silence. Then a strange sound came from Cashin. A laugh. Soft at first, then fuller. Not mad laughter. Not broken laughter. The kind of laughter a man gives when the world has finally become ridiculous enough that dignity itself turns cruel. His shoulders shook once. Twice. Then he slowly lifted his head. Blood had dried at the corner of his mouth. His eyes were bloodshot, but clear. A throne taken by force, Cashin said, voice hoarse but steady, is still theft. He turned his gaze fully upon William. And tell me, Commander Tharvess. He let the title sit there deliberately. Not Lord, not Consul, not Regent, just Commander. When did the king grant his cousin the right to sit in another nation's throne? The chamber tightened. One of the soldiers behind Cashin shifted his grip on his spear. Darius's eyes narrowed slightly, but he did not speak. William regarded Cashin for a long moment. He was very still when he answered. When your gates opened, he said. He placed one hand upon the arm of the seal seat, fingers brushing the cold carved rings. And when your armies failed to close them. Cashin's lips twitched, not with amusement now, but with the pain of recognizing a blade honestly placed. Before he could answer, Griffith stepped forward half a pace. Not enough to challenge the throne. Only enough to become part of the exchange. Legitimacy, Griffith said softly, is rarely granted, Grand Consul. His voice was almost kind. More often, he let the pause breathe. It is taken. Cashin looked at him then. Really looked. And in that gaze passed something stranger than hatred. Recognition, perhaps, or suspicion finally given shape. He wiped blood from his mouth with the back of his chained hand and smiled faintly. Perhaps. His voice was quieter now, but no less dangerous. He looked from Griffith back to William. But cities taken by fire, he said, have a habit of burning their conquerors as well. William did not answer immediately. Outside, the bells rang again. A shaft of morning light cut through one broken window and fell across the chamber floor, illuminating dust in the air like pale drifting ash. It touched the broken Karsic banners, the blood on the marble, the torn hem of Cashin's robe, and the bright silver edge of Griffith's armor. Old order, new power, and the mind that had arranged their meeting. William's face gave nothing away. You mistake survival for prophecy, he said at last. This city is broken, yes, but it still stands. Its granaries stand. Its harbor stands. Its roads stand. What fire has not consumed, Tharvess will rebuild. What fear has not silenced, Tharvess will govern. Cashin's smile deepened by a fraction. Govern, he repeated. You have taken walls, streets, a throne room. He coughed once, a dark wet sound, then continued. You think cities are stone and ledger. They are memory, habit, debt, resentment. Trade spoken in quiet rooms between men who never wear armor. His chained hands tightened. You may occupy Blackhaven, but to own it? To own what Karsic was? He shook his head weakly. You have conquered a carcass and mistaken it for a kingdom. Darius finally spoke. His voice was low and rough, made for command fields rather than gilded halls. Kingdoms are always carcasses by the time men admit they're dying. Cashin turned slightly toward him. There was no contempt in his gaze. Only weariness. And yet, Cashin murmured, some men still choose to bury the dead with honor. Darius did not answer, because there was no answer to that which did not sound like defeat or cruelty. Griffith's pale eyes rested on Cashin a moment longer. You speak well for a man abandoned by his own ship. That landed. For the first time, true pain touched Cashin's face. Only a flicker, but enough. So Griffith knew. Of course he knew. Cashin's laugh returned, softer now, almost private. Then it was not merely force, he said. Not merely siege. Not merely treachery in my counsel. His gaze sharpened. You were already in the dark places beneath this city long before your banners rose above it. William's eyes flicked briefly to Griffith. There it was. The thing beneath all of this. The hidden board. The reshaped game. Griffith neither confirmed nor denied it. He simply held Cashin's gaze with that same terrible calm. Cashin exhaled through blood and smiled one last time. Then I pity you more than I thought. That, more than anything else said in the chamber, seemed to chill the air. William rose from the seal seat. The motion was enough to make every soldier in the room straighten. His voice, when it came, was final. Take them. The soldiers stepped forward instantly. Confine Grand Consul Cashin and Commander Rexer in the lower prison vaults. Double the guard. No one enters without my order. Chains rattled. Rexer was hauled upright with a grunt of pain. Cashin rose more slowly, dignity stitched together from exhaustion and stubbornness. As the soldiers turned them toward the chamber doors, Cashin glanced once over his shoulder, not at William. At the broken rings carved into the throne. At the hall. At the banners. At a world he had ruled and now could no longer save. He was not simply a defeated man. He was the old order walking under chains, carried toward the dark while the new age arranged itself in his place. The doors opened. The prisoners were dragged away. The chamber fell silent again. William remained standing before the seal seat. Griffith at one side, Darius at the other. The bells continued outside. And beneath their sound, faint enough to be missed by any man who had not spent a lifetime learning to hear danger beneath noise, there came just once a low tremor from somewhere under the city. Thank you for listening. I truly appreciate your time and support.